All right, folks, welcome to another podcast. Today, I have a very, very special guest. We actually met at the Jerusalem summit that the ICJ had arranged, and he was one of the keynote speakers. And I was just blown away from his presentation. And actually, we met just before he went to go speak. And so when he got up to speak, I was like, okay, this guy definitely needs to be on the podcast. Because his background and his expertise on this particular issue of Iran, which is obviously the hot news item of the day, and you have people from all over speaking their minds, be it the Israelis, be it the Americans, be it the Europeans. But today, I have my honored guest, Ali Siadatan, who is a Canadian-Iranian Zionist. Yeah, you heard me right. And he is the CEO of the Consultancy and a fellow at the Ideological Defense Institute. He wears many hats, but bottom line is he is speaking the language of the Iranian people, knows the culture, knows and has studied deeply the issues of the Middle East. And that is why he is here on the podcast. Ali, brother, thank you so much for your time and for honoring us with an interview for this podcast.
No, the honor is all mine. I'm very glad to be here, Doron, with you and with your audience. And I look forward to our conversation discussing the vital issues of the Middle East, which at the end of the day is kind of the central part of, the world. I mean, if let's say, for instance, Jews and Muslims in Australia made peace with each other, it would be a interesting and wonderful news item, but it wouldn't change the world. But if Jews and Muslims made peace in the Middle East completely and truly, it would change the entire world because it would ricochet into all the branches among the nations. So it really shows you that this is if the world was a tree, the Middle East is that central trunk from where all the branches grow out. So I'm really glad to, weigh in on this conversation with you here. It's vital, I think.
Thank you. So can you give the audience just a little background about yourself and I guess how you ended up in Canada? I'm assuming that you didn't grow up in Canada or your family, ancestry from Canada. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you found yourself in the polar opposite part of the world.
It was a story of the revolution in Iran happened in 1979, and that was also the year that my parents got divorced. They issued their own passports in 1984. So the war with Iraq broke out in 1980, went on until 1989. So the revolution, in a way, was sealed into place by the war. Once people realized that this faction of the Islamic fundamentalists had taken over, and what they believed in, once people that really sunk in and people were thinking about, counter-revolution, the war started, and that kind of sealed the revolution into place, and everyone volunteered to go to the front because Iran is a very nationalistic country, and people are willing to put aside all differences for preserving the borders and the unity of the country. So it sucked everyone into the front. But 4 years into the war, 1984, the new government felt that they were stable enough, and they issued their own passports for the first time. So for the first 4 years, the airport was closed, and there was no passports. And so for 5 years. So if you wanted to leave, and some people did, you had to go through the Turkish border through people who snuck you out. They had a road. It's a very porous border, and so if your life was in danger because of where you stood, the regime was looking for you, or things like that, then you opted for that option. Others took that option because they felt that who knows when the border, if ever, it will open. and they were desperate to get out. But for other people, life continued. Once you absorbed kind of the reign of the mullahs that had now come, and that's very important to, I think, understand foundationally. Since we're in this part of the conversation, it's good to double up and to make a point along as I'm telling my story, which is that what happened is that when they took over, they implemented um, Islam at the level of the state, right? It's very important to understand that there's a lot of confusion around that. When I hear the dialogue about Iran, I realize that people don't understand how the system is put together.
Hmm.
For instance, the IRGC cannot be taken down unless there's a regime change. There is no other way around it. And the reason for that is because it's part of the apparatus of the state and built into the constitution. The parliament, the constitution, the laws that govern the country created in 1979 the IRGC, and they wrote it into the constitution. So as long, it doesn't matter who's ruling, it doesn't matter which government, what it's supposed to be and its mission is very clearly outlined in the constitution. So as long as this constitution and this parliamentary system are functioning, then the IRGC will function. It doesn't matter who's leading it. It's not based on like we know, we hear Trump say things like, "Oh, there's been a regime change." It's not based on individuals; it's systems. So they took over um, the system that run an entire state. So um, Iran has had many lives. It's been running as a central government for 2,500 years, but this version of Iran is 500 years old. It goes back to 1501
Hmm.
when the Safavi dynasty took over the scepter of centralized rule, and they wanted to carve Iran out. The Ottoman Caliphate was pushing from the northeast or northwest, and the Portuguese had landed on the Persian Gulf, their ships. They were the big European power, and the Russians were pushing from the north um, as Peter the Great, came to conclusion that Russia cannot be a great power as long as it is landlocked. It needs
Hmm.
access to water, and that's why, for instance, um, Putin is so sensitive about access to water in Crimea, and he's just lost the port of Nablus that Assad had given him, which is a loss for him that he wants to get back. The French now control the port. So basically, um, the Safavi in 1501 wanted to carve out a distinct identity that united the country to fight off all of these guys. And they were from a small sect called the Shia, and they decided, okay, let's make that the official religion of the country. So everybody was Sunni. I mean, Shias did live in Iran. There's lots of Shias in Iran because um, they were kind of a small sect, and when whoever didn't fit within the orthodoxy of Islam would escape to Iran because Iran was outside of the caliphate system, and it was very strong. It was strong enough to hold back the caliphate system, and so its independence made it a refuge. And since Islamic law had been now infused into Achaemenian law, but still the government still stood independent from the clergy. It wasn't a caliphate, even though Islamic law had come in at the level of governance as well. But Achaemenian law was still very predominant, and so people would come from the rest of the Muslim world to take refuge in Iran. Um, like philosophers, for instance, they all came to Iran. The philosophers who translated the writings of Plato and Aristotle from Greek into Arabic in the 9th century, and they were seen as heretics, and they kind of came to Iran. That's why all the philosophers of the Muslim world are Persian to this day.
Mm,
The
interesting.
Yeah, so the Safavi decided that they were going to make Shiism the glue that distinguished Iran from the Ottoman Caliphate and united the country around something, and it was successful. So they were able to really build the first. So Iran has ascended to the level of empire several times, and this was the first time it was going to now reach that level in this post-Islamic era. It was under the Safavi dynasty. So they came to power in 1501, and by the 1700s, it took 200 years, the country had become Shia. So by the 18th century, Shiism had now become the religion that distinguished, Iran from the rest of the Muslim world. And of course, the center of Shiism is the south of Iraq, because that's where the
Mhm.
tombs of Muhammad's immediate son and grandson are, that are venerated as the top leaders in Shiism. And so the Shia essentially believe in the succession of prophethood, and the Sunni don't. That's the main difference. And
Mhm.
so when that they took over the 1501, that period of Iran's history is the one we're in right now. I think that historians will record that that period of Iran's history ended with the death of Khamenei. Um, that I think is what in the rear view mirror historians will record, that this experiment of the Shia clergy under the Safavi being empowered, they were allowed to collect tithes. Before they couldn't do that, zakat.
Mhm.
They were allowed to form theological seminaries, madrasas or yeshivas. Before that, they didn't have that. But they decided early on that they wanted the caliphate system that was in the rest of the Muslim world here in Iran as well. They wanted to be the power of government and clergy in one. And it took them 400 years to achieve that, as they kind of conspired against the king. And so there's different dynasties that came after the Safavi dynasty. The Zand took over. They were from Shiraz. Um, then that was also a good period. That we're now in the 18th century, and the after the Zand, Qajar took over, and they're from the Turkish region of Iran. The different regions basically take turns in holding the scepter of rulership, and that's one of the ways the country has remained united, is that it's flexible about which part controls it, because everyone's allegiance is to the scepter of rulership, not to their particular tribe. For about 2,500 years, the country has worked that way. And so the Qajar took over, and they kind of were at a time where um, the Russians and the British were expanding around Iran. And the Qajar court, which was Muslim educated at this point, deeply into it, they didn't have the tools to deal with modernity, because they were like, um, first of all, they couldn't resolve the fact that, why was the Muslim world weakening if it's destined to rule the world? And why are these non Islamic guys, expanding? Then they didn't understand the operating software of the modern world. So if there was like disputes of commerce with Russia, and the merchants of Iran would complain to the court, they didn't even know how to approach Russia properly, diplomatically, to initiate commerce conversation. So they just didn't. and they were kind of at a loss. People think the Qajar didn't care or were not good rulers. But when you put them in the historical context, you realize that it wasn't just that, is that they didn't know how to do it. The world had changed so dramatically from the Islamic paradigm they knew at this point. And so the clergy went into different sects, but one sect, one predominant idea became like the Wahhabis in Arabia, that the way to bring power back to the Muslim world is to become a better Muslim, to become more devout, more fundamentalist, more adherent to the words of Allah. And that line of reasoning led to the 1979 revolution directly.
Mm-hmm.
And so after the Qajar, the Pahlavi rose, and the Pahlavi wanted to reestablish Iranian power. They noticed that Persia had fallen into a dip between the Safavi, which had built an empire, to now we're in the early 20th century. So between the mid 18th century and the early 20th century, there had been a dip in Persian power, and that had caused Iran to lose several important provinces to the expansion of Russia. There's several treaties were signed on both sides, like Georgia, had to be given up, and other provinces on the east that are now Russian or Soviet provinces, but they were given up in two different treaties. The Russians realized that the Iranians could not put up a fight militarily, and so the court was in disarray, and they pushed, and they got it. And so Pahlavi came to rebuild the power. He was a general. He then mounted a coup, and he understood that the reason Iran had become weak is because it didn't understand modernity. And so it decided that it was going to now establish modernity. And he himself was not a very educated man from a bookish type of education. He was, in fact, illiterate. But he was very strong and powerful as an individual. And he was the kind of guy that got things done. So he changed the name of the country from Persia to Iran because he wanted to modernize the brand. That was in 1936. And
where does Iran come from instead of Persia? As far as, is there any special?
It's a Zoroastrian term. It goes back all the way to the pre-Islamic era. People say it means Aryan lands,
right?
But it's kind of like Aryan lands has that kind of a Nazi kind of from where we stand in history, but it's an ancient pre-Islamic term that defined the plateau that Iran sits on. That entire what the Bible calls the Medes. Most Iranians are Medes. Most Iranians are Japhetites, like in the very south west, where Shush is, where the tomb of Daniel is, that is Elam's province, and that's why it's called the province of Elam. And that's where the first nuclear installation was built, in Bushehr. And Elam is the firstborn of Shem, so they were Semites in that area. But the rest of Iran, the Persians, the Medes, these are all Japhetite tribes. And that's why Iran's language is not Semitic, it's Indo-European. Persian is an Indo-European language, and like Greek and Latin and Sanskrit. And that's because all of those lands were lands that took from the Yaphetite tribal system, and that's why they had a common language that historians haven't identified or linguists haven't identified. They simply call it the Indo-European family, and they assume there must have been once upon a time there was a language out of which these guys came. That's why they each took from it, and they don't know what the language is, but biblically that would be Yaphetite, because they're the Indians, the Persians, the Greco-Romans, all of that line, they're all Yaphetite people, as opposed to the Semites, who are in the south of Iran and in the heartland of the Middle East, what is called today, Mesopotamia, Arabia, all the way to Israel and the Mediterranean. And the Hamites were, of course, in the north of Africa. That's why Mizraim, is Egypt is the great son of Ham. And that's why it's called Mesr to this day. And so the tribes that were in the north, the Medes and all these guys, they had this name, the Iran. It was written differently, but it essentially was the name used for all the people living in that plateau. Some people call it the Iranic tribes. The Persians were, of course, one, and they were a small tribe. They were important in their own little region, which was kind of just north of the Elam region. They were kind of close to the Elam. Like, let's say the Lor, which live in Iran, they are an Elamite people.
Right.
And they just live south of the Persian. And so it's a long story that would take us away from our conversation to
Right.
the Persians ascend. But basically, the king of the Medes, the Medes were ruled by 4 different kings. All of them came essentially from the tribe that is today called the Kurds. They were the main rulers of Iran, and they ruled all the other tribes. And that's why they always have this competition going, where they want to resume that. And so when the 4th king, he had a dream about his daughter. It involved in what she was going to birth, and he was very threatened by it. And the short of it is that he decided that he would give his daughter to the weakest of all the kings, so that the son would never ascend, because the dream was about her son. And so he looked at his kingdom among the Medes, and he noticed that, the Persians are the weakest tribe. So he decided that he would give his daughter to become the wife of the king of Persia. And of course, her child ended up being Cyrus, who did take over all of the kings. And from there on, the Persian line became dominant over the Kurdish line. And that has caused, I guess, some friction to this day. And so basically, that's where the name came from, an old Persian name. He wanted to go back to that, not only because he wanted to rebrand the country into modernity, and it was like Persia has too much baggage, but also he realized that modernity can't come in without secularism. That secularism and modernity are 2 sides, essentially, of the same coin. That because Islam is not a spiritual thing, like in Christianity and in Judaism, one can get away with a spiritual religion because the government will only come into place once the Messiah comes and establishes it in Jerusalem. At that point, the world will become a theocracy. But in Islam, the theocracy is now. So that's one difference. And therefore, Islam is not just a spiritual system. It is an all-comprehensive lifestyle and government system intertwined with the worship of Allah. It's inseparable from each other. That's a Western the Western people can't digest that, so they've created an explanation that soothes them. I think that's my belief. And so he
Right.
he uh, he basically, realized that, okay, this system, this Islamic system, is not compatible with this modernity that's holding Iran back from joining the industrial powers and resuming the place of Persia in the Assembly of Nations, because Iran has always had an important place when it comes to world power. It's one of the load bearing regions of the world. That's why it appears in the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar. For those who are familiar with the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible, there's the imperial system of the Gentile nations laid out until the time of the Messiah, and the Medo-Persians are one of them. And that load-bearing reality still exists, and that's why Iranians, including the Islamic Republic, they know the playing what they have on the world stage to play with. They understand the precious thing they have hang on to. They know that this thing has a lot of leverage, this geopolitical jurisdiction, and they
Hmm.
can utilize that leverage. And so the the whole idea for modernity was secularism. So he brought in um, the railway station, the railway. He put rails, trains, so goods could go from Russia, let's say, to the Persian Gulf. He put in, he gave everybody last names. He gave everyone birth certificates, and that gave rise to passports. And he built the first university and modern university, and um, and he then outlawed the burqa, and he asked that women, go out unveiled. This The secularism laws that he brought in were going to seed the Islamic Revolution, because they created resentment in an
Mm.
entire portion of the population, that some people never left their houses after puberty until death because they refused to leave unveiled. And so he went into a Jewish synagogue, and which brought up the standing of the Jewish people, because they had the king has visited the synagogue, and this was his attempt of bringing everyone in under a secular umbrella.
Mm.
Um, the parliamentary revolution happened in 1906, which established the Majlis, the parliament, and that was going to be another seed of the war, of the revolution. It was agreed in the 1906 revolution that the king would establish the parliament, and that over the course of time, slowly the king's power would weaken, um, and the parliament would become more dominant until Iran would find itself closer to the British monarchy system. But the king never conceded to the parliamentary revolution for all kinds of reasons, that Iran is not able to function as a democracy in that way. I'm not sure it can do it even right now. So the king ended up having his own, essentially, um, prime minister, rubber stamped his ideas, and also he had his own eventually political party. And that was seen as one of the grievances of the 1979 revolution by the nationalists, not
Mhm.
the Islamic camp, but the nationalists. They felt that the 1906 parliamentary revolution was never, and the constitution that came from that revolution, the parliamentary constitution, was never respected by the king. So the Pahlavis brought secularism, and then his son began the industrialization process, where everything started to become technologically modern, especially farming. And one of his main ideas was to break the feudal system. Like Russia, Iran was a feudal system. and you couldn't kind of grow the ranks of society unless you were born in a particular class. And so the Shah, he did his best to break the back of the feudal system by attacking and reorganizing land ownership. And a lot of the land was owned by the clergy. And he took the land from the clergy and gave it to the peasants that worked the land. And now they became landowners. And this was another fuel into the fire of the 1979 revolution. The clergy was upset at the amount of lands they lost in this in modernity revolution.
Mm.
And so modernity began to grow. And that became the central grievance of the Islamic fundamentalists, that everything was going away from the ways of Allah into westernization. And so what happened was, when the revolution started, the first act of revolution is seen by historians as the burning of Cinema Rex in Abadan, which was the oil refinery town. The oil refinery was built by the British, who discovered oil in Iran. And there's a lot of British expats that lived in Abadan, and there was a whole infrastructure to entertain them, including a cinema that showed Hollywood movies of women wearing miniskirts and kissing out of wedlock and all kinds of things. And so they burned that cinema down as their protest against modernity, against the infusion of non-Islamic ideas. So the wall of Islam was something that modernity could not climb these clerics. And the clerics in this feudal system, they focused their preaching on the areas of the cities that were lived by the poorly educated and poorly educated people. A lot of them were hoodlums. That's why when you hear a lot of the clerics speak, especially in Persian, they speak in the dialect and language of hoodlums, which is own. They have their own way of speaking when it comes not only to accent but even to turn of sentence and phrase. They'll say things like, "Well, you know what?" Like this cleric was saying recently. So people have left Islam because they discovered in the latest protest where people burnt down 28 mosques that the country has left Islam. And these guys were in their own bubble. They didn't quite understand that. And now they saw it. And then he's like, "So people have left Islam. Well, then we can kill you all. Then it's not a problem. That's what we're going to do. We'll kill you all." And so he was just speaking, and the way he was saying it, just his statements and his language and the choice of words he was using were the kind of words that, let's say, if you were to translate this properly, it would sound like a Italian mafia movie where they have their own dialect or their own way of talking. And so he speaks in that way because their followers come from that part of society. And so they're very brutal, and they could weaponize these hoodlums. So they burned the cinema down and took over. And everyone was like, there's many different political parties involved in the revolution. They all had agreed that Khomeini would be the patron who would, bring the transition of power relatively peacefully from one side to the other. The king had left the country because he refused to shoot at his own people. He said, "I won't shoot at Iranians." And Carter and the leader of France, England, and Germany, they got together in an island, and they decided that they were going to support Khomeini and build an Islamic belt against the Soviet Union from Afghanistan to Iran. And so
sounds like a great idea.
Sounds like an incredible idea. They basically forged the Red-Green Alliance that has now taken over, Europe and even Canada, Australia, and the Democratic Party of the U.S. right there and then. And so this guy, when he took over, at first was supposed to be a transition leader, but it slowly became very clear that he had his own ideas of government, and he started to kill all the other leaders essentially, and established what he called Islamic government. He'd written a book, Dolat Islami, and he is like, this is the way it's going to be. He had been living for 14 years in exile because the king had exiled him. And Khamenei, who was just killed by Israel this year, and I think that ended this experiment of political Islam. He was in jail. The king had put him in jail, and so was Rafsanjani. Was in jail. Many of the leaders of the Islamic Republic were in jail. They were arrested by the secret services, Savak, and they were put in jail in the 1970s. And Khomeini, when he took over, he just freed all of them, and they came up and they took over. And they brought in, the Islamic government. And so what the idea was to take the system that was now fully functional and govern the entire country. As I said, Iran is completely functions as a unified governmental system, with branches in every province that's completely deeply intertwined and elaborate. And so he now had to Islamicize the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so the parliamentary revolution was not going to work under him either. And so people said to them, they're like, okay, well, we're going to have a parliament finally, and we're all going to have political parties. What's your political party? To his followers. And his followers were like, wait, we don't believe in that. But if we have to choose one, then we will call ourselves the Party of Allah. And so they came up with the name Hezbollah. That's what they called themselves. And that's why to this day, they're called the Hezbollah. And in Iran, that's what people just refer to them as. And so they said that will be our party. And then once they took over the government, they took over the entire government. They were the only party. They killed everybody else. And Khomeini was their rahbar or leader. And they then changed the name to the Islamic Republican Party. And under that, they ruled for 47 years. And then in 1982, they planted a small militia in Lebanon, which continues to bear the name that they gave themselves, at the beginnings of the revolution, as an extension of their party.
Which, by the way, is translated as God's warriors, correct?
Hezbollah means party of Allah. Hez means party. Allah means
okay.
Yeah, party of Allah. So that's what they call themselves in Iran, and then they planted. So the branches, they have branches in every neighborhood, in every city. And their symbol, the hand holding the Kalashnikov, you can see it from a distance. And these branches they have are training compounds for people who want to be like, volunteers to enforce Sharia law on their neighbors, basically. And so that's the Hezbollah rules the country and has for 47 years. And so that's why this idea that people say, why is Lebanon like part of their negotiations with the United States? This is another. The Iranian system is first of all an imperial system. Every few hundred years, Iran forms a Middle Eastern empire, and I don't foresee that cycle ever completely coming to a halt. Since the time of the handwriting on the wall, where Iran essentially has received the scepter of rulership over Mesopotamia, Egypt, Assyria, and it continues to influence the region from that spirit. It's just a question of how it can be very evil and dark, or it can be something that's more benevolent, like through art and literature and science and philosophy and things like that. So right now it's very dark, But for them, this is a direct extension of their of who they are. It's not, they don't see it as another country. They just see it as the extension of who they are. So for them, there's no difference. There's no sunlight between the branch they have in Lebanon or the branch they have in Tehran. It's the same organization as the Hezbollah. So they then created this government where they said, okay, the Quran will become the basis of the Constitution, which means that the laws that are in the Quran, literally, if it's something that's very clear, it says da 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 da. Well, that'll now be the law that will govern that part of society. And for instance, all of these protesters that are arrested and they are charged with crimes against Allah, and then they're killed. Well, that's because that's a literal application of a surah within the Quran. And the judge, he is literally, according to their Islamic system, doing his job. He's just implementing that law. So that's why the idea that you can change the system by putting a mild person in there, it doesn't work that way, because the system of government, the Constitution, and then Sharia law is the Quran, but also other writings and interpretations of clerics over time that forms a jurisprudence. And the leader of it is the head juror, who is called the faqih. And the name of the government is the rulership of the faqih, Velayat faqih. That's the official name of the government in Iran. And it's another thing that's too difficult in the West to pronounce. So a lot of the concept that the West has of Iran are just things that Iranians just allow the West to just float in, because the bridge of communication seems so wide that you have to have like constant lectures just to bring people up to speed. So you just say, yes, Supreme Iran Islamic Republic, just let's go with that. It's easier. So Velayat Faqih, and Velayat Faqih is then put in the Constitution in Article 5, and I can read it right now out of the Constitution. That becomes the cornerstone of the Constitution. During the occultation of the Waliul Asr, may Allah hasten his appearance, the Waliya and leadership of the Ummah devolve upon the Adil, or just, and Muttaqi, pious, Faqih, who is fully aware of the circumstances of his age, courageous, resourceful, and possessed of administrative ability, will assume the responsibilities of this office in accordance with Article 107. So you have to kind of, an Iranian person reading that Article 5, which is the basis of the Velayat Faqih, the system they created, wouldn't understand what they just read. First of all, Persians don't speak Arabic, so there's a lot of Arabic words. That's why they have to put the Persian in bracket. But also, they're not just words, they are Shia theological concepts. So you have to literally go to seminary or take a dictionary of theology to understand what is this even saying. Mm-hmm. So this was kind of the idea that the government became a theocracy. Not a democracy, not a parliamentary democracy, not a kingdom, but a theocracy. So the clerics then brought their jurisprudence. That's why the leader is called the faqih, the juror. What does that faqih mean? It means the rule of the jurisprudence. That's the official translation into English. That's the name of the government of Iran, the rule of the jurisprudence. And Article 5 then defines what that is. It says that the head juror, the supreme leader, as he'll be called, as that's his honorific term. That's just like the polite way of referring to him, as opposed to calling him like faqih. People would just call him the supreme leader, meaning that among the jurors that are administering the law of Allah over the land, he is the leader. He's the head juror. He is the rule of the jurisprudence. And so he then, it says in Article 5 that he is the representative of the Mahdi, of the Imam who lives in oculation until his appearing. That's what it says. And so that's the key of bridging the royal power and the clergy into a single office. That is the verse. That is the Article 5 is what does it. But it also infuses it with the Shia concept of the succession of prophethood. That the prophethood went from Muhammad to his son-in-law, Ali. Whatever anointing fell over Muhammad continued over Ali, then over his sons, Hassan and Hussein, and over their descendancy for 12 generations. The 12th Imam was then disappeared as a child, and angels, like the story of Jesus, said he'll come back or be sent back when the world needs him in a time of chaos. And so he fell in a well, and down the well he went. And so the 12th Imam is in oculation. He still governs the affairs of the Islamic world as the one who is on whom the anointing of the Muhammad's prophethood has fallen. He just governs the ways of the Muslim world from oculation, from a place of hiddenness. And Khomeini, who created this system of the Velayat Faqih, he then said, while he's in oculation, his power, his anointing, his command falls on the supreme leader, or as the Constitution calls it, Faqih of Iran. And so he becomes the vicar of the 12th Imam until his appearing, while before the 1979 revolution, the Shia saw the king, as they said, in the Safavid period as the bridge to the Mahdi, meaning that the clergy will do its own clergy things, circumcisions, funerals, weddings, spiritual teachings in mosques, etc. But the king will rule the government until the Mahdi. The king will be the bridge between the current age and the age to come. Khomeini collapsed the two into one. He is the representative of the Mahdi, and he is the head of state, and he is the head of the clergy. He collapsed all of it into one, and because he went to Egypt and met Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and who inspired him to reinvigorate the Muslim world by implementing Sharia law and creating a caliphate system and creating the expansionism of Islam, he took from the Muslim Brotherhood those teachings and brought it into Iran. That's why the branch of Shiism that runs Iran is very close to the Muslim Brotherhood, minus the succession of prophethood. And that's why other Shia who don't adhere to it object, and they say, this is not how Shiism works. This is Muslim Brotherhood, Sunniism, disguised under Shiism. And so he created this, and then he hired this guy who was a philosopher, actually, who now defected and lives in the States, and wrote an open letter to Khamenei to rethink the school system according to Islamic law. So the school system from grade 1 to the end of university would teach you the Islamic view of life. The media was then brought under the control of the supreme leader. He has direct control over the media and over the army. That's why the Iranians refer to the media as the second army, because those were the two things needed to create indoctrination. That was their idea. So they brought electricity to all the villages, and so that the villagers could have television. And then they played sermons all day long and all night. Really, that's the TV was divided between sermons and the news. These were the only two things. And so people in Iran wanted to know after the revolution what was really happening, because everybody was fully adult and their minds were formed outside of this system that these guys were now trying to bring in. And so people wanted the news. And the closest news station that everyone relied on was Radio Israel. And so my mom, after my parents got their divorce, my mom had to find a way to make a living, and she went into import export. And one of the things she imported was long wave radios, because there was a huge market for those radio stations, for those radio units, so that people could listen to Radio Israel and figure out what was happening inside of Iran, because they understood that they were being fed propaganda by the Islamic government that had taken over, that people felt that they wouldn't last, because how could the clergy possibly rule the country? They had gone to seminary. They had gone to the equivalent of yeshivas. They didn't understand politics, economics, military arts. They didn't understand how the world was run for them to survive this complicated world at the level that Iran likes to play in on the world stage. But what they didn't know, what people didn't know, so they assumed incorrectly, and they just felt it was going to fall apart. What they didn't know was that there was another guy, and it was like a duo. His name was Ali Shariati. Ali Shariati was a professor in the University of Tehran. And he was a suit and tie guy. He wasn't a cleric. And he had a PhD. And he came up with the idea of how a modern state could be run by Islamic law, by 7th century law. He wrote many books. In fact, there are bookstores in the poor areas of town that made an entire living just selling his books. And so he then had the Khomeini's disciples were more among the people. He had many disciples, but they're also among the clergy. But Ali Shariati, his disciples were more technocrats. He was a University of Tehran professor, and his students were economists and technocratic people who could run the bureaucracy. And then the Warsaw Pact nations, under the guidance of Russia, the Soviet Union, and Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, had collaborated with Khomeini while he was in exile in Iraq for 14 years. They collaborated with him to train a series of militias in the Arab world that would serve him in his Islamic ambitions. And those militias, there was 8 or 9 of them, they then came together, coalesced into a single organization, and they called themselves the IRGC. And that organization, many of the leaders of those militias from the 1970s are now the generals of the IRGC. And that allowed Khomeini to then have an army ready for himself. And they put that in the constitution as well, as far as what is the function of this thing that they created. The ideological army. It says, in the formation and equipping of the country's defense forces, due attention must be paid to faith and ideology as the basic criteria. Accordingly, the Army of the Islamic Republic of Iran, that's the Artesh, the army that existed at the time of the king, and the newly formed Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps are to be organized in conformity with this goal, and they'll be responsible not only for guarding and preserving the frontiers of the country, but also for fulfilling the ideological mission of jihad in Allah's way. That is, extending the sovereignty of Allah's law throughout the world. This is in accordance with the Quranic verse, prepare against them whatever force you are able to muster, and strings of horses, striking fear into the enemy of Allah and your enemy, and others besides them. So the IRGC was then created because Khomeini saw that the king fell because the army turned against him. And the clerics figured if they had an ideological army that swore allegiance to the cult of the supreme leader, as recorded in Article 5 of the Constitution, they would be much more stable because even if the people abandoned them, their cult, their military of their own cult would stand guard. And that's why they're called the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. The corps, the C stands for corps, and guard is not really pasdaran, which is their name in Persian, is translated as guards, but there is another way of translating pasdaran, which I think is more accurate. It's guardians. They are the Islamic Revolutionary Guardians. They are the guardians of the cult of the supreme leader or the cult of the faqih.
Mm-hmm.
And so they created the Article 5, and then they created the ideological army, and this is all in the Constitution. So you can't dismantle any of this unless you change the Constitution. And to change the Constitution, that's the last article of the Constitution. It explains how the Constitution can be changed. And the Constitution, I can scroll all the way to the bottom of it. In the last article, it says the revision of the Constitution, Article 177. The revision of the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, whenever needed, and the leader issues an edict to the president after the Constitution with the nation's exigency council, stipulating the amendment or addition to be made by the council for revision of the Constitution, which consists of member of the Guardian Council, head of the three branches of government, permanent members of the nation's exigency council, 5 members among the assembly of experts. That's the assembly from which the supreme leader comes. 10 representatives selected by the leader, 3 representatives from the council of ministers, 3 from the judiciary, 10 from the members of the Islamic Consultative Assembly, 3 representatives from among the university professors, and it goes on explaining the method.
Wow.
So you can't change the Constitution. The cult of the Mahdi, the cult of the faqih, their IRGC, the funding that goes, there's a budget that according to the Constitution, the laws that are implemented. And that's why the Iranian people came. So the reform, the 2008, 2009, when people came in the street, that was all about reform. It was about changing this theocracy through the parliament. The idea was that people would vote into place candidates of this reform party, which were secretly secular, and they had vowed that they would start changing these laws through the parliament. And so once the clerics understood that, they created a new office of Islamic requirements to be candidate in the parliament. And Rafsanjani, one of the main clerics who was in prison at the time of the king, but had become one of the main clerics of the regime, he became the leader of that. And in this way, they eliminated virtually 90% of the candidates and retook the parliament, filled it again with their own people. And the reason people wanted this was because after the war ended in 1989 and the baby boom continued, which had happened in the 80s during the war and after the war, a middle class developed. Since they had at this time completely consolidated their power in the first few years when we were there, it was very, very, very brutal. Through brutality, they had the IRGC, which is, as it says in the Constitution, designed to attack the outside world. That's the purpose of it, to expand the ideals of the revolution or the law of Allah. And they quote the same exact verse that is champion on the banner of the Muslim Brotherhood. They use the same verse, the expansionist verse of Islam, and they then created an internal unit to the IRGC called the Basij, and the Basij was designed to extend Sharia law into the population through Islamic devotees who would volunteer to become basically a reserve army. They receive training. Where they receive the training? In the Hezbollah compounds that are everywhere in all the cities. And there they receive indoctrination, military training. They get some money and food. And they then became kind of like the civilian police within the police. So they would rat you out. Oh, I heard my neighbor listen to music. Or he was eating during Ramadan. And sometimes they would be in your family. Like, you could have a family, and one person would be a royalist, one person would be a communist, one person would be secular, and one person would become a devout Muslim. Like someone would become an Orthodox Jew while their brother might be secular. It's kind of like, it was like that. So suddenly someone in your family was the problem. He was the spy. He felt that his allegiance to Allah was more important. He was doing you a favor, basically. He was saving your soul by bringing you to the indoctrination camps where you could now, learn the righteous way. and so this was kind of the reign of terror period. But by the time we got into, that period of 2005 to 2009, the reign of terror was no longer that necessary because they had completely consolidated power and they had relaxed. And two societies had formed side by side. They ran their clergy, they ran their government, they used oil money to build their nuclear facilities and all the things they wanted for their Islamic expansionism as outlined in all of their writings, in all of their sermons, and as put in the Constitution, to mix the Persian imperial power with the Muslim Brotherhood expansionism under the guidance of the succession of prophethood of Shiism. The three had now merged into a single unit. The expansionism of Persia, the expansionism of Islamic Muslim Brotherhood, and the succession of prophethood that made the leader of Iran the anointed spokesperson for God. All of these things had now merged into a single thing, and the money of oil was fueling the building of it. And the IRGC, the war ended, and the IRGC guys came back. And they had grown battle weary during the war with Iraq. They had gone from being like a small, like a group of people to becoming these hardened soldiers. But the parliament felt that, these guys, the economy was in shambles. The revolution had happened, the war had happened, and they would just become addicted to opium, or they would just be troublemakers. So the decision was made that they could form corporations. They could form corporations as long as they did not disband from their units. They could own pieces of the economy and run it as long as they remained a army. You as a person who served in the IRGC couldn't own a company that ran the gas fields, but your unit could. And so this was the way that it was decided that they would have a job. And so Jihad Sazandagi was called, the jihad of reconstruction. You've done well on the front. You've protected the frontiers against the Sunnis and against their, American supporters. But now you must rebuild the economy. And so they started to take over corporations. And because of their connection with the government and the clergy, they were given the right to get into big industry like oil, gas, the nuclear, like Ghalibaf, the guy who's the chief negotiator for the IRGC. His construction company built all the missile cities, and that's how he made his billions. He's a billionaire, and he is, of
He's
course,
going to negotiate against his own interests, right?
well, the idea is that he wants to keep his money. The messaging that's coming from Trump is that the silent part of the deal is that he's received word from within that if he accepts certain compromises, they can, inside, pull down some of the theocrats and begin the process towards integration. And Ghalibaf wants to keep his billions of dollars and not lose his head. Many of the other guys who became billionaires under the system were killed by Israel. Shamkhani, he was beheaded. The strike actually beheaded him. Wow. And so he survived the 12-day war. He was injured. He was hospitalized. He couldn't breathe. He had a hope, but then he recovered. But then he was killed later, which was a good thing. Everyone was very sad that he wasn't killed. But he, when Israel in the 12-day war hit his condo, and they were showing videos of his condo, you could see in the video his Bitcoin farm. He had his own Bitcoin farm in the condo. And so the government in Iran put an entire section of the grid, of the hydro grid, aside for Bitcoin, because that was a way to go around sanctions. Mm-hmm. And so China, Russia, and Iran own the heart of Bitcoin, and that's what gives it stability. And so basically, these Ghalibaf, built missile cities. And he's part of the IRGC. So they all created companies within the IRGC to control, the oil, the gas, the nuclear. And they started to kind of grow into power. And they started to think, as they became wealthy and influential, why are we not running this place? Why are the clerics running it?
Right.
And the way the clerics wanted to take the king down, the IRGC went into this idea of taking the clerics down. So Khamenei, who is now the leader, he decided that he was going to fill the ranks of the IRGC's leadership with those who pledged allegiance to his son, to ensure the continuation of this whole thing. And when the Americans came and they took Saddam Hussein out, that then opened the gates of Mesopotamia, where they were saying over and over again that they were going to liberate Najaf and Karbala, the two Shia sites in the south of Iraq, and then liberate Quds, or Jerusalem, from the Zionists. This was one of the mottos. This is one of the things you chanted in the streets, in school, for Najaf, Karbala, Quds. This was the plan. And everyone kind of inside laughed, and nobody cared, because they couldn't even take Saddam Hussein down. They couldn't even liberate their own Shia holy sites in the south of Iraq, and they wanted to go all the way to Israel and do war with Israel. So no one really paid attention to this idea. And so the middle class kind of grew in the 2000s, and people wanted to change through the parliament. They didn't want bloodshed because their dads, who had been the revolutionaries, they said to them, listen, with hindsight, we've learned three things. One, revolutions can be very bloody. Two, they can unleash forces that exist within the system that we didn't even know about. And three, they can produce an outcome that's very different than the intended outcome. So you're better off to change the system through the parliament. It'll be bloodless, and you'll know exactly what you're voting for, who the candidates are, what they're saying they're going to do. But like I spoke to one of the student protesters from 2008, 2009, who eventually moved to Canada. And he said to me, we didn't understand Article 177, which is the article I read you of how you have to change the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Can't change theocracy. They sealed it into place. They made the supreme leader the representative of Allah, and then they sealed the Constitution by creating such an obstacle to change that virtually if all of those people come together, all of the that I read, and all of those different sections of the system come together, that is like saying we're letting go of this. That's regime change, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
the only way the system can change. And so when people came out and they protested the election of Ahmadinejad for the second time, because everyone knew that no one had voted for him, and so the protesters said, "Where's my vote?" That was their thing. That's when, after a few weeks, Khamenei then said, "No, Ahmadinejad has won. Let's get on with our lives." And the next day, the protesters came in. That's when a new units came out that no one had ever seen before. They had motorcycles and they spoke Arabic. These were units that had been brought in to act in suppression, because slowly at that time the clerics had started to understand the country had turned against them because the Talibanization program had failed. That part of trying to Islamicize the culture had failed. And so the discrepancy between the people's vision of life and the clerics was now growing. So they brought in these units that were trained specifically for crowd suppression and killing. And because they were Arabs, they could kill Persians better, easily, with
Mm-hmm.
more distance, emotional distance. And they came out and started killing. And then we saw the same units save Assad in Syria when the Arab Spring happened, which was the Iranian protest of 2009 then inspired the Arab Spring, because Iran always leads the Middle East in trends, the same way that the theocracy in Iran in 1979 pulled the entire Middle East in the direction of political Islam, which led to October 7th. If the regime falls and secularism, which is now what unites all the political parties, takes over, the entire Middle East will shift in that direction. And that's why the Arabs are so scared of Iran's counter-Islamic revolution coming out, because it would affect Afghanistan, Pakistan, Qatar. It would affect all of the Turkey. It would change all of the places that the Muslim Brotherhood rules right now, from Afghanistan to Qatar to Turkey to Syria and to half of Libya. All of these Muslim Brotherhood ruled lands would massively take a hit if the cultural revolution in Iran were freed and opened. It would change the chemistry of the entire Middle East, and that's why they're so concerned about it. So the 2008-2009 suppression forces came out, and they were called the forces of Sarkoup. Sar means head, Koup means crush. They were the head crusher units, and they started to kill people, and that changed everything. That was new, and then Obama got elected. This was the end of the Bush era. The great financial crisis had happened. And Obama then started to do the negotiations over the nuclear, and he put on sanctions for 8 years. And those 8 years then killed that middle class that had been formed. And the reform movement took on a new shape, which was about the JCPOA and creating an economic lifeline to reinvigorate that middle class. And people could now travel. Europe had dropped its visa requirements. And so people had traveled. The internet had come into existence. Young people were now growing up. And they were seeing a world outside of Iran that was very different from Iran. They were realizing that Iran and North Korea, as one of my cousins once told me, he said, so let me get this straight. Iran and North Korea are the only two isolated countries in the world, because Iran's supreme leader has an ideological war with the president of the United States. And I'm like, yeah. So the young generation was like realizing as they were growing up from kids to teenage to their 20s, and their minds were opening up, and they were now traveling a little bit, and they're looking through the internet, and they're going, wait a second, how come the rest of the planet works differently and is connected, and this we're not? And now they were kind of having to back study the stuff that I've been telling you to
Crazy.
understand what had happened to them.
It's interesting because I think that's the only country that I understand that the Ayatollah had visited when they took over after the revolution was North Korea.
You're right. And
is that correct? Like that's the only country he's ever visited? And
yeah, I don't know. I mean, they're very, very adamant about never leaving. Once they become leaders, they don't even leave their house too much. But
he was very impressed with the way they were managing their society.
Right. The North Korea
tells you a lot. That should tell people a lot, because it's two different ideologies, right? As far as what's guiding the ideological reasoning behind that kind of iron grip over their society. As you pointed out, I mean, they haven't seen the outside world or understood how the rest of the world operates, if you like. And it's terrifying if you think about it. And to me, of course, I think the IRGC is way worse because it's got that Islamic caliphate style of thinking that's kind of a little bit more dangerous, if you like.
Yeah. I think that the leader of North Korea has divinity claims as well. I mean, there might be a demonic force behind him as well, because Christianity was really expanding in Korea before the whole thing got shut down. In this case, it's about weaponizing the scepter of Persia against Judea, against Jerusalem. If from a spiritual point of view, because of all the empires in the past, the Persians were kind of more friendly with the Jewish people. The establishing of the Second Temple period, when it comes to building the temple, building the walls of Jerusalem, establishing the law of Ezra's, copy of the Torah as the main copy. All of this was by decrees of the kings of Persia. And of course, the killing of the last of the Amalekite kings, Agag, was also decreed by the king of Persia, where he sided with his wife Esther. So the Persians didn't like the Greeks or Romans or Babylonians attack the Jews. They helped establish the Jews and ignite the Second Temple period. And so the Islamic conquest of Iran and the rise of the 1979 Shia Caliphate then actually flipped that on its head and weaponized the scepter of Persia against Judea, plunging the entire Middle East into war, aligning the most important Gentile jurisdiction against Jerusalem, and the ingathering of the Jewish people from the nations. This created the friction that's now brought the entire region under darkness. And so how can this be broken but only through war and economic pressure and revolution and the arming of the people? So to come back to the question you asked me about my personal life, I wanted to just give the background about, when they took over. So they established their own system of governance. And then in 1984, they gave their own passports. And so the passport before 1979, the Iranian passports, it said on your passport, Imperial Iran. That's what it said on your passport, Imperial Iran. After 1979, your passport said Islamic Republic of Iran. And so went from Imperial Iran to Islamic Republic of Iran. What they did with the Imperial is that they changed it to Shia, expansionism. And then when the Americans came and they took Saddam Hussein out and the gates of Mesopotamia opened, they were able to pour in. And when Iran crosses the Euphrates, this is the tradition, when Iran crosses the Euphrates, it forms empire. That's kind of always the case. And that's why one of the demands of Secretary Pompeo all the way to the Trump administration now, until this MOU, but until now, it has been that the Iranians must withdraw east of the Euphrates, their forces, and
Interesting.
and
Yeah.
and go back to the plateau, the Persian plateau. So you got the Mesopotamia, which is a plain, and all these Gulf states that are in the plain. That's why they can't defend themselves against the IRGC. The topography is against them, right? You get to Mesopotamia, and you have the 10,000 feet, 12,000 feet at times mountains that form an L, both on the north, the Caspian Sea and Russia, and all the way in the south of the length of Mesopotamia, Assyria, Babylon, or what's today Iraq, and around the Persian Gulf. That's where they hide all of their ballistic systems to hit the ships, to control the
Mhm.
Strait of Hormuz. It's not the only thing they have going, but they have a whole system set up there. They have missiles that fire from underneath silos into the water directly, that they purchase from China. And so basically, these mountains, 10 to 12,000 feet high, form a plateau. And that plateau is where the Iranians live, and it's larger than France, Poland, and Germany combined.
Mhm.
And from these mountains and the two deserts that form Iran, you can have a lot of deep hiding places. That they have deep hiding places, as you know. And so if a Gulf state goes and shoots at one of them because they coordinate, great, maybe they got a shot in, but their desalination plants, oil refineries, population, everything is now just up for the grabs because they live in the plains. And that's why Iran can descend on them and shoot at them without any defenses. And that's why they don't take the chance to go to war, because the topography favors Iran. And so the Arabs have a very different relationship with the Persians. First of all, the Arab Caliphate of Muhammad scissored the Sasanian Empire. So Iran was now in its third imperial age, the Sasanian, and it stretched all the way to the Mediterranean until Muhammad's armies came and they severed it. They cut it. And they took what was west, of the Euphrates, and that became different caliphate systems: the Caliphate of Baghdad, the Caliphate of Ottomans, the Mamluks, the Caliphate of Damascus, the Caliphate of Egypt. And then the Iranians were pushed back to their heartland east of the Euphrates River. And that created bad blood between the Iranians and the Arabs that continues to this day. The Iranians want to regain that area, but the Arab Islamic system, is in its way. And so the Shia supremacist idea is a way around that, a way of, again, exerting Iranian power over the Arabs, basically. So the war between the Arabs and the Iranians is based not on religion, but on a power struggle. That
Mhm.
the Arabs destroyed the Persian Empire, cut it into two, the Sasanian. And so the basically, once they took over Mesopotamia, and because Saddam Hussein was toppled by the American military, that changed everything. That opened the door to Jerusalem. Suddenly, everything changed. So the small unit that they created at the beginning of the revolution, the IRGC had a dream. And this dream was that it was one day going to liberate Jerusalem from the Zionists. So they created a small unit called the Al-Quds Brigade. And
Mhm.
this unit was the unit of the IRGC designed exactly for that function. That unit grew in power and influence to the point where I would say it's now the central unit of the IRGC. Some people refer to it as the SETCOM of the IRGC. And so they grew in power and influence within the IRGC system. and the leader was killed in the Iran-Iraq war. So they looked to see who in the unit had leadership quality to replace him. And there was a young man, and he had shown some leadership quality, and his name, he eventually became, General Soleimani once he grew up into the fullness of the role he was given as the head of the Al-Quds Brigade. And he then got to work, and he began to build the Shia Crescent. Now that Iraq had fallen, the Shia Crescent could be built from Afghanistan's Shia communities all the way to the Mediterranean, where Hezbollah already existed, the Hezbollah of Lebanon. In Iran, you always say the Hezbollah of Lebanon, because if you don't, all Iranians will assume you're saying the Hezbollah of Iran. And that's on the news. They also say that the Hezbollah of Lebanon, because whether it's diaspora news or it's Iran news, because you have to put of Lebanon to make sure you're talking about the small militia that's in Lebanon. So the Hezbollah of Lebanon was there. Iraq was now under Shia control, and Soleimani began to build the Shia Crescent until the Arab Spring happened, and he offered protection to Assad in exchange that Assad would become a Persian province. And so he agreed. And now Damascus became the linchpin that connected the entire crescent. From Afghanistan to the Mediterranean, Damascus became the connecting point. But the problem was that Gaza had Arab support, but Arab support left Gaza. And so Soleimani saw an opportunity. So he went and said that Iran would give Hamas money to build itself, and they accepted. And with Hezbollah in the north and Hamas in the south, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which was the Iranian unit placed inside of Gaza, that then formed what's called the Ring of Fire. So the Shia Crescent and the Ring of Fire were constructed, and the whole thing was run out of Damascus, Unit 2000 of the IRGC, which is what Israel struck in the beginning of the war, which led to the first volley of ballistic missiles. Nasrallah was not the leader. Nasrallah is just an employee of the IRGC. The leader was the general of the IRGC that was in Damascus. Then that general was replaced because he was killed by Israel. He was replaced by General Zayedian. And that general was in the bunker with Nasrallah, and he was killed. And I saw the video before he left Tehran to come to Beirut. He said that he felt in his guts that he was going towards his martyrdom. And he was right. Men may know that their time has come, and that was over him. Maybe God was giving him a last chance to repent, to do teshuvah, and to turn his heart right. Yeah. But he didn't listen. And so he came to Beirut, and he was in the bunker with Nasrallah when he was killed. And so the IRGC was running this Shia Crescent and this Ring of Fire that was built because America took down Saddam Hussein. And then Iran controlled the land, but didn't control the air. So Soleimani went and met with Putin. And we don't know what he told him, but afterwards Putin agreed that he would bring his jets and land them in Latakia. And now Putin controlled the air and Iran controlled the ground. And in this way, together, the what America brought to the table, the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force, the idea was to match that through a coalition of connectivity. And then drones started to become a thing. And Iran decided that it was going to go into the drone business and really started to go into drone and took even the lead from Russia in building drones. And then the agreement was that Russia would then give jets and Iran would build. There's a very, famous video that I watched where this Iranian general is meeting with an Air Force leader from Russia. And he says, look, if you combine missiles, drones, and jets together, if you weave the three together, you will create a new form of combat
that is unseen and undefendable. And we have come up with the architecture of that, and we will build it for you if you give us the jets. We will give you the drones, and together we will weave together the ballistic missiles, the drones, and the jets together to create a single aerial expression of violence. And they shook on it. He said, yeah, that's a great idea. And they shook on it in the video. So between that and the Hezbollah in the north and the Hamas in the south, the idea of the Ring of Fire, the Shia Crescent, the Russians coming in, and that's why you kind of really see the miraculous nature of Israel's victory in just blowing it all up and removing, Assad from Damascus, Nasrallah from Hezbollah, Khamenei died in Iran, the Shia Crescent is in shambles, they were hit all over the country. The economy is collapsing. The currency has collapsed. They have taken a huge hit of unfathomable proportions, and you don't quite realize the miraculous nature of it until you fully understand, how much preparation and effort they put into building this thing. So in the 1980s, when they issued their passport, we left and we didn't have a lot of places to go because no one had bilateral relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran in those days, in the early 80s. They were kind of a pariah state and you couldn't get a visa to go anywhere. But my mom had been very entrepreneurial, and she had created a business, a hair salon, basically. And the wife of the consul of France was her client. And she arranged through her husband that we get a visa to go to Paris. And we did. And so we went to Paris, and we were able to stay in France for 4 years until 1988, when we came to Canada. But the Islamic Revolution, which brought religion to the forefront of everyone's mind, also affected me in the sense that I started to ask myself questions about the existence of God and about the veracity of which religion was the truth, and was the Quran really the words of God. And as a child, I had a spiritual experience that really marked me. It was during the Iran-Iraq War, and we had gone to stand in a line to get a food ration, because food was rationed. And there was a kiosk there selling, chocolate bars, cigarettes, newspapers. And I looked and I saw my favorite chocolate, Yum Yum, which was like Kit Kat. And it was like a wafer. And I wanted it. And I decided right there and then to make it a test of God's existence. I prayed and I said, God, because my grandmother was very strict, and her standard response was, it's going to ruin your lunch. And I knew she was going to say that. And so I prayed to God. I said, if God is real, she'll say yes. And that's how important, it was very hard for her to say yes. It was very standard no. So I tugged on her coat and I said, will you buy me a Yum Yum? And in my head, I said, no, it's going to ruin your lunch. And as she turned around to look at me, her eyes had grown really big and weird like this. And then she said to me, not only take one, but take two. and I just reached out and I said, I believe. And I took two. I don't know. And that's it. That started my spiritual search. And I realized that no one in my family knew what was in the Quran, because now we had to learn it at school. It was in Arabic. It was a language no one understood. I realized as a child that the adults have no idea what's in this religion other than those who are devoted to it. And eventually my spiritual search continued when we came to France, and I was kind of introduced to secularism and atheism and critical thinking. That was huge. And the questioning of Sharia law, that was huge. And then we moved, my mom was secular. So when I said, well, what am I going to do with the pork in the cafeteria? She said, just eat it. They didn't have refrigeration back in the 7th century. Porks developed worms. Now you can eat it. Now it's all clean and sanitized. I was like, oh, you can question the Quran. So that really was a huge moment.
Yeah.
And then when we came to Canada, I guess I was introduced to the Bible, and eventually I decided that I'd never heard the gospel because the Islamic Jesus or Isa is a prophet who brought Sharia law to the Jews, as Moses brought Sharia law to the Jews. Allah was always people. I hear always often Jewish people say, "Oh, Israel is in the Quran." Yes, Israel is in the Quran, but as an Islamic nation, Israel is in the Quran as all the Jews worshipped Allah, not as a covenanted people. The way that the Hebrew Bible presents it. It's a rethinking of who Israel is, who the God of Israel is, who all the prophets were. They're all there by name, but they wear a completely different clothing of identity. It's a rethink of sacred reality. So the modern Jews should submit to Islam because as the Jews were always the students of Allah and in the monotheistic tradition, then they would naturally have to accept the prophet whose message is universal. Moses, Jesus, these guys were local prophets. Yes, they had books, but they were local prophets. They brought Sharia law to a local community. What makes Muhammad exceptional is that the Sharia law that was revealed to him by Allah is universal. He's the seal of the prophets, and God's no longer going to send prophets to different parts of the world, as that's the Islamic view. He's now sent the final prophet, the Jimmy Jam of the prophets. And therefore, by hook and by crook, everyone has to believe. There is no possibility of peace, and that's why what the Islamic Republic is signing with America is a hudna. It's a temporary armistice to build back better and attack again when Trump is no longer president. Their entire goal is to survive the Trump presidency. And they can see that, in Israel, Naftali Bennett is already talking about toppling the regime, and they follow Israeli and American politics and news very, very, very closely. And they listen to everything that comes out of the mouth of American and Jewish politicians. When before October 7th, I remember watching several sermons by Khamenei where he was literally on the edge of his seat. I'd never seen this before. And he was commenting on the demonstrations between the Supreme Court protests and the Knesset of Israel. And he was saying, I've never seen Israel this divided. Now is the time to attack. Now is the time to attack. And I was like watching this, thinking, really? What does he say? And with hindsight, I realized how in tuned he was in following Israel's internal dynamics so closely that he could pinpoint a moment of weakness with such precision and turn it into a command. That
that's
Yahya
interesting.
accepted.
Yeah, because also Yahya Sinwar of Gaza, right, the head of Hamas, or the mastermind of October 7, that was exactly what he was saying as well, or his observation, based off of the division and protest in Israel. Now they're weak. We can attack and whatnot.
Yeah. And so so that was an important piece of the puzzle, I guess. Yeah. So when we when they Muhammad's universal message redefined Jesus as an Islamic prophet, and when I came to Canada and I heard this other version of who Jesus was, I never heard it before, and I was like, really? And I wasn't interested in religion. I saw religion just as like a series of laws, rituals, decrees. I was interested in a direct experience of God. I wanted God to say hello to me. I used to say to myself, if God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, he can appear to me as well. It was arrogant, but I think I was saying it from a very childlike heart. I was, and so this idea that Jesus' sacrifice was the gateway to connection with God, and that you had to kind of say this formula that you had sinned before God and that he had died for your sins, and you offered that in the spiritual world as your sacrifice, and you accepted he came back to life on the third day. This was the formula. And I was told, this is the ticket. And I was like, really? This is it? So I tried many different religions at this point, including Eastern religions, Hinduism. I got into Zen Buddhism, chakras, energy work. I'd gone all over the place by this time, trying to look for that direct connection. And I thought, okay, I guess this is worth a try. This is what, every time I go for one of these religions, I went deep in and I did everything you're supposed to. And if it works, then I know it was true. And if it doesn't, I'll just classify it as another religion in my library of religions, and I'll move on in my spiritual search. That was my thought. So I thought, well, you know what? I don't know what the laws of the God of Israel are, but I definitely know that I can't even live up to my own conscience. Even what I vow to myself to do as a man in my own conscience, I fail to live it out. So if I have broken the laws of my own little conscience, then surely I can only assume that I have broken the laws of God, whatever they may be. And so I decided that, I was going to go for it. And I went for it. I did the whole prayer, honestly, sincerely, and said, yes, I believe in this. And I went to bed. And the days that followed, I was reading the writings of Omar Khayyam, who was a Persian poet, a Sufi. And he talked about how life is too mysterious for anyone to figure it out, that we don't even kind of know where the universe is. We don't even know where we are. Life is a deep mystery. And so in the days that followed, I had this question that came to my mind, and I decided that I was going to release it to God. And I said, I don't know, God knows. And I don't know, that was the moment where there was a huge explosion of energy inside of my belly, I felt, and this spirit came over me that was very powerful. I had to lie down on the couch, and I was watching TV and turned the TV off, and then I had visions, and it was quite strong. But the most important thing was that I was aware of the presence of God suddenly, and I couldn't believe it. It had actually worked. And so I went to this center where they were teaching me these things, and I was like, what is this? And they said, oh, this is called the Holy Spirit. And I'm like, oh, it's that. And so I started to open the Bible. I was like, wow, I can't believe this actually worked. I became aware of the presence of God, which I am to this day. And so I started to read the Bible, and it took about 3 years for me to figure it out. The system, how it was laid out in the Bible, that it had to do with the temple, and that the human body was itself a temple, that there were several temples. There was a temple in Jerusalem, there was a temple in heaven at the heart of time and space, and then there was a temple which was the human body, and that there was a veil that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple, and this was torn when the sacrifice had happened on the tree. And so that inside of me there was a veil in my inner temple, and this veil separated my consciousness and my spirit from God. But once sin was removed, which was the issue, then God's spirit entered the Holy of Holies of my inner temple, where my spirit dwelled, and my spirit and God's spirit met now that sin was taken out of the way. And that's why my consciousness had become aware of the presence of God, because my spirit and God's spirit had connected in the Holy of Holies of my inner temple. And so now I understood why the system had worked. I understood the logic that was laid out, at least behind it. And that's when I turned my attention more to the study of the historical aspect of the story. And that's when I started studying Israel and the archaeology and the history of Israel, and the prophecies that came with it, because the history of Israel is prophetic. So there's a story where God meets Abraham in the plains of Mamre and announces kind of the supernatural birth of Isaac in Sarah's old age. where she's well past the age of childbearing, signifying that this is going to be a miraculous birth. And there, in a way, God prophesies the reality of Israel into existence. The covenantal system will pass from Abraham to Isaac, this supernatural birth. And so from there on, the story of Israel is prophetic. God speaks Israel into existence, not through natural human means. He promises it to Abraham, but he waits until they're past the age of childbearing in order to announce this vessel into existence that will have a prophetic destiny. And from there on, the Bible's narrative focuses on the interplay of prophecy and history to tell the story of Israel, which makes Israel's story unique, and the entire system of the Bible unique. Even the New Testament is built on this. Only 3 years of Jesus' life are recorded because they match his birth, an event from his childhood, and 3 years of his life because they match that which the prophets of Israel said about the Messiah. The idea is here to record that which was said was now occurred on the stage of history. And the book of Acts, which records the coming of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of the God of Israel, also is there to testify that which the prophets of Israel said, Joel and Isaiah, Ezekiel, all of the prophets that spoke of the Spirit, that was now fulfilled. And so the entire design of the Hebrew Bible, both before the time of Jesus and after it, is designed around future telling. That God says and God does. That's the interplay between prophecy and history is the basic narrative structure of the Bible. And that's what makes it different from all the religious books that I had studied. The Quran, the Avesta of the Zoroastrians, the Vedic texts of India, and the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of Balkrishna, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Sutras of the Buddha, the Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, the Analects of Confucius, and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I have gone through the Enuma Elish in just a rudimentary way, the ancient scriptures of Mesopotamia from the land of Shinar, which were the basis of the polytheism of the entire world, Babylon, India, and the Greco-Roman world. They all really drew fundamentally from the Enuma Elish, the main scripture of human civilization, until the Hebrew Bible came out through the Christian movement into the nations. And none of these texts that are assigned to the Elohim, to the gods, have the signature of the Bible, which is the telling of the future. And the idea is that the author of this book is sovereign over humanity and over the angels, and therefore directs the movement of history because all of creation answers to his decrees. He can decree the movement of history because he is the God of gods. He is over all of them. He's the El HaElohim, the Adon HaAdonim. He is the one who is the sovereign over all of these spiritual forces that are over the nations, including Allah, and including whoever is behind, whatever is behind Marxism or other demonic structures that are coming out. And the future telling is part of the signature system. It's not the only signature system, but it's one of the main ones. Probably the main one. It's a sign. The prophecy is a sign to Israel that this is the God of gods. And so that was really fascinating as I turned my attention to the study of all of this. And in 1999, I really felt this voice telling me over and over again that I should go to Iran and tell my dad that one day there will be a war with Israel, according to the scroll of Ezekiel, and that he should not agree to this war in his conscience, even though he can't do anything about it as a regular civilian. But in his conscience, he should disagree with this war because God is with Israel. And I had this recurring thought over and over again. And eventually I decided that this thought was not normal. So I decided to go and tell him tell him this message, that I thought it was from God. And at first he just was like, "Oh, well, thank you so much." He was very polite about it. "Thank you for being so considerate and coming all the way here to tell me this. Appreciate it." But in the next day, he called me over because the Russians had come and signed a military pact. And he said, "Didn't you say Russia would be involved?" I said, "Well, some people say that Russia may be involved." And then he got really interested in the Bible. He said, "This book tells the future." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, that's good for business. I want to know more about it." And so we took the deep dive in the Bible, and him and his wife got baptized in that trip because they came to faith. We read everything from the book of Genesis. We were reading the Bible 8 to 9 hours a day. And I had 2 weeks to go over everything. And after they got baptized and they're very excited, we eventually got to the New Testament. And in John chapter 22, that's when they got baptized. They said, "Let's go to Shiraz," because that's where the family is from. And it's an 11-hour drive south. And we drove in the middle of the night because Iran has the highest rate of car accidents because nobody follows the rules of the roads basically, including speeding. Speeding is a huge thing. And I remember, coming down from his street, you turned left. And when, I was sitting in the car and I put my seatbelt on, and he laughed. He said, "You're the only person in this country who's put a seatbelt on." And when we came down, suddenly he turned left, and there was this huge traffic, lanes and lanes of traffic coming. And I realized it's a one-way street. And I'm like, "What are you doing?" And the traffic just parted like water all around the car. There was not a single horn or anything. They parted all, and he just went through. And he said, "Look, forever." No, he explained it to me. He said, forever, this was a two-way street. And just a few months ago, City Hall decided that they wanted to make this strip a one-way. Wow. And he said, "We disagree. We collectively disagree with that decision. So we're going to keep using it like it's a two-way street." And so that's the thinking, it's like, whatever. And that's why as the society separated and this Islamic system built its militias and its, crescent system, ballistic missiles, and nuclear program, people live disconnected from it in their own world, focusing on their lives, their trips, their building. The Iranians at large see what's happening with Israel and the United States, first of all, as an Islamic war. They don't see it as an Iranian war. Mm-hmm. And since Iran has undergone mass de-Islamization, on January 8th, when the Crown Prince said, "Come out," 8th and 9th, and the regime made fun of him, saying, like, "Who's this guy? Like, no one's going to listen to him," because, he had about maybe at most 30%, 25% of the people were behind him. But because people made a strategic decision this January that they're never going to get past this regime unless they unite behind somebody as an alternative. And then collectively, the decision was that he's the only guy that not only has experience in politics and has international renown, but he is an heir to the throne. And the throne is an age-old acceptance form of governance that can be a legitimate transition authority system. They just collectively, like in a moment of time, it took some time. But they decided that he was the guy, especially the young generation. So we're now in the tale of generations. So the older generation, the grandfathers, they made a deal with the covenant. They made a covenant with the clerics. They really did rebel against the king. And they brought in the Islamic Republic. And then they realized it wasn't all that it was supposed to be. Paradise on earth, the law of Allah, it all seemed so great, but then it was very bad. Why? Because the law of Allah ended up being very dark. And so the country went through a national discovery of Islam. And you'll hear this often in the Sunni world as well. People who are leaving Islam, they will often say that they didn't know what Islam was. And that's very common in the entire Muslim world. Right. And so people then read the Quran for the first time and they're like, "What? This is crazy." And so there was
what do we sign up for?
What do we sign up for? And there was like mass defection from Islam. And then the children of the revolutionaries, they tried the reform movement, and that didn't work out. And then we got to the grandchildren of the revolutionaries. And the grandchildren of the revolutionaries, they are right now the ones leading all the protests. They're leading this entire change. It's really a tale of generations. So one generation brought in the clerics, one generation wants out. And the generation that wants out, they have set sail towards secularism. And that's why in Iran, there was far less anxiety around revolution, because Iran has a long history, and being governed for 40 or 50 years by a dark force is common. This has happened many times before. Once everyone saw that the younger generation formed the majority of the population and that they collectively wanted out, then it was just a matter of waiting for them to grow up and slowly take over the country. Yes, at some point there would be a skirmish. At some point they would have to get armed. At some point there would be a final battle. But by that time, like grass that's growing and pushing from underneath, they would have the collective national strength to pull that off. So it was about just putting your head down and living and allowing the movement of generations to cycle through the history. But then their nuclear desires and the pressure that came from Netanyahu drove so much economic hardship that led to the JCPOA reform movement, it was called, which died in 2016. That movement completely died. It doesn't even exist as a political force anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And Trump pulled out in 2018, and that system never replenished the economy. So then there was a bit of a limbo, and the young kids were growing up until 2022. In 2022, the Mahsa Amini protests happened, and this woman who was killed by the IRGC and by the Basij. And that sparked, for the first time, revolution. It went through everybody like electricity, the whole country, and even people living abroad. Everybody felt it. Revolutionary spirit. There was a conclusion in 2022 that there is no reform. Reform had been tried, and that had failed. Trying to make a deal with the West had failed. The revolution was the only way through. And after the war, after the 1979 revolution, after the war to Iraq, after rebuilding the country, after the bloodiness of the whole thing, it took a long time for the country to come to the psychological place where it was like, we have to go through this again. It took a lot of time for it to come there. And in 2022, the younger generation decided that this was the only way out. And so they really were the protesters, but they couldn't get their parents to come out, and they couldn't get their grandparents to come out. They couldn't get all the factions to unite, the workers, elements of the clergy, what was left of the middle class. It was mainly a student-driven protests. And the price of gas went up 3,000% overnight. And that brought the blue-collar workers out for protest. Soleimani was killed by Trump. These were all preparing things. And then the war of October 7th happened, and it took some time for the world to figure out that Iran was behind it, but Iranians knew immediately, that Iran was behind it. And so at that point, they finally had the war, because when America took out Saddam Hussein and the gates of Mesopotamia opened and the Shia Crescent was built and the Ring of Fire was built and the Russia came in, the clerics and their disciples, they changed gears from traditional Shiism to Mahdaviyat, which is the prophecies of the end of days. These prophecies were all about the liberation of Jerusalem from the Zionists. Why? Khomeini in 1979, when he took power, following the weakness of Iran going back to the 19th century, where the clerics had decided that the solution was a deeper adherence to Islam. They decided in 1979, Khomeini taught that once the country comes under Sharia law and everyone begins to live as a more devoted Muslim, and the television system they hoped would indoctrinate the next generation, which failed, that the once the country was purified through adherence to Sharia law, it would become strong enough, spiritually energized enough to break Israel like a twig. That's what he said. And that would bring about the Mahdi. And the Mahdi would then lead the IRGC into a victorious, well, Isa, the Mahdi's sidekick, the Islamic Jesus, he would then lead the IRGC into a war with America and would defeat the United States, supernaturally charged. They could pull it off. And so this was the idea, but no one talked about it because they couldn't even take Iraq. They couldn't even liberate their own places. Jerusalem seemed like a far-fetched dream. But once Mesopotamia's gates opened, because America came and opened that gate and defeated Saddam Hussein, and the Shia, which were 60% of Iraq, took over, and the Shia Crescent was built and the Ring of Fire was built, that story started to come to life. Suddenly, the road to Jerusalem had opened. Suddenly, the idea that you could go to war to liberate Quds was now becoming a real thing. And so the IRGC added a unit that indoctrinated young recruits into the doctrine of Mahdaviyat. And the clerics began to teach it more and more as a central element of the foreign policy towards Israel. The time was getting close. The time of the appearing was getting close. So Ahmadinejad he renovated a mosque system where they believe is the well where he fell into. And when he arrives, he's supposed to arrive from one of the provinces of Iran, Khorasan. From there, he will come to this mosque that has been renovated to the tune of $3 million by Ahmadinejad, and he will hold sermons there. So on Yom Kippur of 2023, about 2 weeks before the war started, General Bagheri, the head of the joint forces, the head of General Salami was the head of the IRGC, but General Bagheri was the head of the IRGC and of the army. He was the head of the joint forces. He gathered tens of thousands of IRGC units, and they were kind of like Nazi soldiers all standing in front of Jamkaran on Yom Kippur, 2 weeks before the war. And on the ground, they wrote in Hebrew and in Persian, "Israel must be erased." And he made a great speech about how these guys were, in fact, the greatest in his own mind. The speech was great. These guys were the army of the Mahdi in waiting, these units of the IRGC. And they were going to take on Israel and erase it off the map and then take on the powers of global arrogance, they called it. And so that was, he was killed by Israel during the 12-day war. He was killed. General Bagheri was killed. And so that idea that finally the path to Jerusalem had been opened and the age of the Mahdi was upon us became more and more the central messaging of the governmental system until, I'd say by 2016, everybody in the parliament adhered to it, not just the IRGC and the clerics in charge. So that became the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic vis-a-vis Israel. It was all about bringing about the Mahdi, the way that the Orthodox Jews wait for the third temple and Christians at large wait for the second coming, but a portion believes that it's connected to the rebirth of the Israel as a nation. And the reemergence of Jerusalem that kind of thinking now I defined the regime's attitude towards the state of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And so when October 7th happened, they lived in the assurance of victory. And when they lost and Khamenei was killed, they took a huge spiritual and ideological hit. Many of the units within the system, the de-Islamization of Iran is not just happening within the population. It's happening within the IRGC and the Basij as well. Meaning that families that belong to the Basij and the IRGC are secretly leaving Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And the death of Khamenei was a huge blow to their religious paradigm. This was the opposite. Everything went the opposite from what they were taught. They are the ones that lost Nasrallah. They lost Damascus. They lost a huge amount of internal damage, including the leaders of the IRGC and the leader of the revolution, Khamenei. So a lot of them are rethinking their religion. They're rethinking what they were being taught. And so the strike that they have received is very deep at the level of the spiritual. It's rattled their understanding of the true nature of reality and of what is true and what's false. They are not, a lot of them are not crazy people. They're just indoctrinated, but they are thinking human beings. They do have a brain and they consider these things. And so there's a great, change happening. But the population at large, for the first time, they saw the opportunity, the revolution that began in 2022 was accelerated by the judgment that Israel brought on this theocracy. It accelerated it because suddenly all kinds of things began to happen that they never even imagined in their wildest dreams. The leaders of the IRGC started to drop dead. The stronghold of fear began to collapse. The supreme leader was killed, Khamenei. And Israel began to even, send in UAVs and drones that were killing Basiji checkpoints. And so this changed everything it accelerated the revolution tremendously in speed. And for the first time, it put the idea in the mind of this young generation that they could organize in revolutionary units, that they could actually see the light at the end tunnel. Before this war, there was no point because these guys were so powerful. Even it's taken America and Israel to weaken them, and they still stand. And right now they're just they're 50 million barrels of oil. 50 million barrels of oil have left Iranian ports since the MOU has come into place. I did the math yesterday. It's about $3.8 billion US that's pouring into their pockets just since the MOU has been removed, because they had tons of oil in containers ready to go because they couldn't shut down the wells. When Trump put the blockade against them, because they blocked the Strait of Hormuz and Trump put the blockade in, they couldn't shut down the oil from being pumped because the oil wells are really old. And the gas is about 5,000, 6,000 meters underground. There's a huge amount of gas pressure. And when you strike it, the gas pours into, the hole that you've created and pushes the oil up. And that's how the oil gushes out. But when the oil well gets old, the gas is depleted. And if you shut the oil well down, you may never, ever be able to turn it back on. You have to go through a huge expense of injecting gas into it. It's a huge expense and a huge trouble. And so they realized they can't shut the oil wells down. They thought, what if we get through all of this? Then we won't have any money. So they started to burn the oil that they couldn't store. They first stored the oil everywhere they could,
Crazy.
in cargo ships. And then they just burned it so that the oil was coming out, but it was just flames of fire because they couldn't go. So the moment they got the MOU, they had containers and ships full of oil ready to go. And they just all went out east towards China and other ports. And I was reading one of the top energy experts of the world yesterday on Twitter, who follows every barrel of oil in the world. That's his job. And he said that since the MOU, he has counted 50 million barrels leaving Iran with the transponder system turned on, so he can easily see which ships they are. And I did the math based on $75 to $78 worth of barrel. I mean, that's the kind of the price Iran is selling it at, and it comes to $3.8 billion going into the hands of the IRGC, who control the oil industry at this point. And the clerics that run it. I mean, also, I said, loose ends. Let me finish the loose ends. I said the IRGC wanted to rule the country. So when Khamenei died, they finally got their chance. They took over the country. And they wanted to put their own cleric in power who would be a puppet cleric. And so the new supreme leader, whatever state he is in, he is very cozy with the IRGC. He's very extreme. His dad, who grew up, before the revolution, was prisoned during the Shah's reign. His dad was kind of like, grew up before the revolution. He had other ideas in his head. But his son grew up entirely in the construct of the Velayat al-Faqih, and his dad being the supreme leader and president before that. But when he went to seminary in Qom, he had 4 teachers that were really his main teachers. But the one that he gravitated the most towards was Mesbah Yazdi. He became the main seminary teacher that Khamenei Jr., the gay Ayatollah they call him, that he really gravitated towards. And Mesbah Yazdi is the leader of the Hujjatiyeh. And the Hujjatiyeh is a sect of Shiism that in 1983, Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, this extreme guy, he banned the Hujjatiyeh because he felt that they were too extreme. So just imagine how extreme they must be for Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood, created a Shia militant system. He banned them. And so it's the best kept secret. Mesbah Yazdi, he says publicly, of course I'm not. I'll never be the leader of the Hujjatiyeh. But everybody knows, everybody in the whole country knows that he's the leader of the Hujjatiyeh. And so Khamenei's son, the guy who's in power now, he considered Mesbah Yazdi to be his favorite teacher. And he adopted the doctrine of the Hujjatiyeh. And the doctrine of the Hujjatiyeh is that the Mahdi will arrive at the time of great upheaval, and the purpose of the Islamic Republic's revolutionary success is to create that upheaval. The guys outside of them, they believe in this idea of building the Shia Crescent, getting to Israel, destroying it. Then the Mahdi comes. They have a story of how it all happens. The Hujjatiyeh believe that the more chaos they create in the world, global terrorism, whatever they want to do, that will hasten the coming of the Mahdi. So they want to go out of their way to become more radical, more militant. And that's why in January 9th, so when the Crown Prince had come out 8th and 9th, the regime made fun of him, saying that he has no supporters, which was true. He only had 25%. That's why they let him live all these years. He was useful. He divided the opposition, but could never unite it enough to be a threat. So suddenly, when people came out exactly at 8:30 in 31 provinces in the millions on January 8th, they're surprised. So the next morning, which was Friday, January 9th, Khamenei went on television and he made a sermon and he said, 400,000 people died for us to take power. And if 400,000 more have to die for us to keep power, that's halal according to Islam. And all day long, his goons on TV came and said, tonight, don't let your kids out. Because I said the millennials and Generation Z are leading the revolution. Don't let your kids out, because if you do, we'll consider them as rioters, and we accept protest, but we don't accept riot, and we will kill them. And their bloods will be on your hands. You, the parents, will be responsible for the death of your children. And after Khamenei's sermon in the morning and the goons coming out, that evening on January 9th, everyone was so incensed at what they were saying that everybody came out. The parents came out. The grandparents came out. People with wheelchairs came out. People with strollers came out. And they overwhelmed the security systems. There wasn't enough security agents to take care of a crowd this large. So they just had to sit back and watch it. And because they never thought this would happen, the internet was completely on. And everyone was able to film all the videos. And to send a message back to Khamenei for his remarks the second night, the protesters burnt down 28 mosques. And they burned down 28 mosques, some very important mosques, huge mosques, headquarters of the IRGC and the Basij. And then they burnt down a seminary. They burnt down the Hujjatiyya seminary, the one of Mesbah Yazdi's school, the one that believes in this chaos, the one who is the idol of the new supreme leader. And they burned down his seminary. And so the message was sent to the regime that this is against Islam, that the division is deep. And that's when they decided that they were going to shut down the internet and send the people out with rifles. And then the protesters would gather for about another week. And then they shut down the electricity to the areas where the protests were happening to plunge everyone in darkness as they began to shoot them. And there's one famous image where people have come out on the highway and they're walking and they shut the electricity down, and everyone takes their iPhone or whatever Samsung for phone they have, and they turn the flashlight on and they're all waving it in the air because they don't have any light. And that became an iconic image of the protests. And so in the Middle East, Iran is the country that has the most amount of non-Muslims and the most amount of pro-Israel people in it, tens of millions of people. And the force of darkness want to hold this down because it would change, of course, the dynamic of the Middle East, of the world, because the Islamic Republic is a Goliath of the global anti-Zionism program, and their influence reaches deep into the West, even into the United States. And so to cut them down through a constitutional regime change, which is what is needed to defeat the IRGC and the clerics, the Constitution, as long as it stands as it is, it continues to funnel the resources of the country into these departments as the law of the land requires it. So you can't get away without regime change. And the only leader that has emerged to threaten them now is the Crown Prince, and that's why they then turned their entire propaganda armada against them after January 9th. It was a new paradigm, and by cutting the internet down, they wanted to take over the narrative war for the Westerners by shifting the blame on Mossad and tapping into global anti-Semitism, which is their propaganda wing. And that was built by General Ali Naini. He's the architect and creator and head of the IRGC's psychological warfare department. He was also killed by Israel during these war that happened. He was after the 12-day war, he was lifted up and given a new role that directly answered to Khamenei himself, to elevate the importance of psychological warfare as the global propaganda program to rally the nations and the parliaments of the world against Israel and to weaken Israel's ability to wage war against the Islamic Republic by tying its hands behind their back politically, by rallying the nations democratically against Israel through their government systems. This mission was given to this general, the architect of the psychological warfare department of the IRGC unit that is, in charge of this aspect of the war. And so Israel killed him, but that unit was the unit that designed all the psychological programs that kept the people down in a state of fear. Once Talibanization didn't work, they used advanced psychological programs to fracture the country and to keep it under the stronghold of fear.
Mm.
So in 2022, when the Mahsa Amini war revolution started, in 2023, we saw unprecedented number of people, like 5-6 kilometer lineup of cars coming to the tomb of Cyrus and the Achaemenian sites. And the great Zoroastrian flames were lit up all around Persepolis. And tons of people, in Zoroastrian outfits held hands, something we've never even seen during the time of the king. And this was people rebelling against the fracturing of the country under this program of fear. Once they could not unite the country under Islam, as the constitution states, Iran is no longer a nation. Khomeini, the founder of the revolution, he said he hates nations. He believes in Islam. The Muslim Brotherhood wants to rebuild the caliphate. And what's against the caliphate is the modern concept of nation states. That's why the Mufti of Jerusalem could not accept the partition plan. It's not the Islamic way of forming government. And so the nation state is to be replaced by the ummah. And that's why it says in the constitution that the supreme leader, the faqih, is the leader of the ummat, which means the plural for ummah, the Islamic community, not the millat, which is the Iranian word for people.
Mm-hmm.
And so once they could not unite the country under the ummah, they decided to divide the country through psychological programming that this department of the IRGC created. It wasn't only for warfare against Israel, by rallying the nations against Israel through propaganda. It was also for fracturing the country. So in 2023, when everybody came to Persepolis and to the tomb of Cyrus, this was the beginning of the healing of the country in forming unity around an alternative identity. And what was chosen in 2023, these were all stepping stones of this revolution. What was chosen in 2023 was the pre-Islamic identity of Iranians. As people had left, and that's why they came to the foundation of the nation, to the one that brought all the tribes together and created central government through the satrapy system that continues to run Iran to this day. So what Cyrus's ingenious act was that before Cyrus, when like the Kurdish tribes ruled the Medes, allegiance was tribal. So the Persians had their own system, the different tribes of the Medes had their own system, father, son, uncle, cousin, and everyone pledged allegiance within the tribal system to the one that was strongest, the Mede that ran all the Medes, the king of the Medes. But Cyrus saw the weakness in this system, that it could always fracture into tribalism. So he created an innovation. He created the satrapy administrative system, where now the country, united under one rule, was ruled by an administrative system that was not based on tribes. So you could be from this region in the northwest, but you were the governor of this region in the southeast. You could be from this region, but you are now the governor of this other region, because all of Iran belonged to all Iranians, and the satrapies were administrators taken from different tribes and regions, but into a centralized system where they ruled far away from their own kin, from their cousins, from their uncles. they ruled in a completely different region where they had no family at all. And as this system, took hold, it formed a very strong, united, centralized governmental system. And of all the satrapies that he created, 31 remain, which run the country today. It's not in a direct line, as in like exactly he created this many, and then at the time of Esther it was 270, whatever, and then it kind of came back and 31 left. It's more like the idea that he put into motion survived and is now manifesting in these 31 provinces that's why like Ghalibaf, the guy who signed the MOU, the guy who built the missile cities, who's negotiating with Trump, the billionaire, his dad is Kurdish, his mom is Persian. Or Pezeshkian, the guy who literally signed the president, his dad is Turkish and his mom is Kurdish. But they are both, still Iranian central government agents. Doesn't matter what area they're from. They serve the satrapy system that combines the administrative system of Iran together. The different regions get a go at controlling central government. But the administrative system is mainly controlled by the cities that belonged in the ancient times to Persians and the Medes. And that's how the power balance is kept. The different tribes can hold the scepter of rulership, but they can't do anything without the administrative system. And so the symbiosis creates unity through the satrapy system that unites the nation under central government and allows it to play at the level of empire and dance with the big players like Russia, England, America today. But before that, the European colonial powers, and before that, the Roman Empire. So the Persians and the Romans divided the world, and actually Judea was a borderland. And so the Persians controlled until the Romans took over, but the Hasmoneans actually, even reached out to Persia. That's why the Magi, who were the Zoroastrians, and they were the choosers of the kings of Iran, and they were the counselors of the kings of Iran. When they came, we don't know how many of them there were, but when they came in the story of Jesus to Herod, who was a governor, an administrator chosen by Rome, he panicked. He thought the Persians want to take Judea back. And that's why government officials have come. And that's why they say to him, where is he who was born king of the Jews? Meaning that you're not the legitimate ruler of this province. We are going to decide, or we're going to put our own Judean continuation of the Hasmoneans on the scepter of Judea, and he will fall in line with the king of Persia. And that's why we have sent the Magi, who are government officials. And that's where the Iranian parliament gets its name from, the Majlis. And so the Iranians were kind of like, had this empire. Then Alexander the Great came 2,500 years ago, and the Greeks took over, and they ruled Iran for 200 years before the Persians took back the country from the Greeks. But that began a 2,500-year war between Iran and the Greco-Roman Empire. So the Iranians then tangoed with the Greeks and then with the Romans. Then Rome divided into all of these nations. And each one, like the Portuguese, as I said, were in the south, in the Persian Gulf, each one, the British, the Russians, the Portuguese, every single one tangoed with Iran. And then came the Americans, the young Yankee Republic. And that's why the Iranians are not concerned with America, because we don't know where America will be in 100 years or 200 years. But Iran has a feeling of it'll still be here. And so for 2,500 years, the central government that Cyrus created has had to ward off the threats from all the versions of the Greco-Roman world. That's why Trump was saying that to open the Strait of Hormuz, he wants the French, the English, and the Germans to send their navy, because they are the ones whose economy is more affected by the oil that comes from there. But that has been the case. They all have to usually unite. All of Rome usually unites to wrestle Iran down. And so the idea that Iran is a collection of tribes or something, we don't know where that idea comes from, because the system inside doesn't work that way, and it can't play at this level by even functioning that way. It sees itself as a continuous civilization where the central government at times has had less power or more power, depending on how strong it has been. But very quickly, it always grows enough power. And that's why the Kurds, for instance, that are the Medes, they can never separate. They could never separate for 2,500 years. They couldn't separate under the Shah. They haven't been able to separate for the last 47 years under the rule of the Islamic Republic. And whatever government comes next, they won't be able to separate under it either. They cannot overcome the united force of centralized rule. The majority of the nation will line up with the central rule, and that isolates them, and so they can't overcome it, and that's why they never do. And that's why when the January 8th and 9th happened, after that, all the Kurdish leaders, every single one, went on diaspora television and said, we want to make it clear that we're not separatists, we're federalists, because they understood it would be a death sentence when nationalism was at an all-time high. In the time of the Islamic Republic, where people were fractured, the government was seen as corrupt and Islamic, there seemed like there was an opening, because no one cared. Everyone had lost the passion. But now that the passion returned, they knew that they feel it. They understand nationalism for Iranians, I would say, is their main religion. The way that Zionism is for the Jews, nationalism for Iranians occupies the same place that Zionism occupies for Jews in their psychology. And that's because unless you're united under the scepter of Persia, you cannot keep forming these empires. And to form empires is nearly the raison d'etre of Iranians. I was talking to one of the dissidents here, and he's very pro-Israel, but he's remained Shia, and he's in all the protests. And I said to him, I just want to get something straight. Once the government falls and a new government rises, we will form empire again to the Mediterranean, right? I just wanted to test him, see what he had to say. And he just was sitting down on a chair in the backyard at a Jewish party. And he just stood up like a soldier, snapped his heels together. That was his reaction. And he said, but of course. And so, and he's, very much against the Islamic Republic. So the idea that anyone would threaten the national unity of Iran immediately makes that agent like someone that is producing something to which you have an allergic reaction. It immediately makes that agent the enemy of the entire country. Mm-hmm. So right now, when Israel is against the government of Iran and comes and does the 12-day war and everything, everyone just sits back and lets it happen, which is not normal. Iran, if Turkey or Saudi Arabia were to throw like a pebble into Iran in normal circumstances, the entire country would like click together like a unit and just like march over and take Mecca. Like that's how Iranians think. That's why all the Arabs and all these countries are afraid of Iran, because they know the Iranians, outside of the 77 years of the modern state of Israel, they have a different relationship with the Iranians. Iranians are not, you don't kind of trigger that. Once you trigger it, it has a life of its own. It just goes like that. And that's what happened with Saddam Hussein when he attacked. He thought, oh, they're weak. They've dismantled their army. All their generals have been either killed or escaped. Their air force has no pilots. I can take the oil-rich resources where a lot of the Arabs live from the Caliphate age and keep it. And the entire country just let go of revolution, counter-revolution, regime, everything just went into the backdrop. Literally, hundreds of thousands of people literally volunteered to go to the front and formed a people's army that pushed Saddam's armies out and reestablished the national border. That's the psychology of Iran. That's why during this year's war, where suddenly from Israel there was a lot of idea that, oh, we're going to arm the Kurds, or this created massive panic in the Iranian opposition, because it immediately brought the Iranians that were against the regime and the Iranians that were in the regime together. It united everybody suddenly. In the middle of the war, where everyone was against the regime, Israel's rhetoric suddenly united everyone back together. And this was a moment of huge panic. And that's why everyone was like on Twitter, leaders of the opposition figures were writing, you got to stop this, because the unity of the country is more important than anything else. So it's not that the people are siding with Islam, is that by de facto Islam wins, because they have to, the IRGC puts away its quarrels and the people put away their quarrel and everyone suddenly unites as an Iranian. But when you come out the other end, their ideology is intact because you were deflected from fighting it to preserving the country. And so there was a lot of confusion. Is Israel trying to defeat them or unite the nation against itself? So the Israel can bomb Iran all it wants. Nobody cares. And so everyone's just sitting aside because everyone sees this as an Islamic war that Israel is involved in. But the moment Israel shifts its focus from defeating the Islamic Republic to supporting the fracturing of the country, it rallies all Iranians in a national war. It suddenly, the war expands beyond Islam. It becomes truly a war against Iran. It becomes a whole other thing. You'd be like walking into a trap, essentially. So some of the ideas that these regions are going to all rise and unite and fight against the central government, these ideas are not Iranian ideas. There is no, within the Iranian psyche, there is no evidence that this can ever happen. The cities that became the great metropolises after the revolution, where everyone from all the regions moved into cities to get a job. And so like Tehran had 1 million people living in it in the time of the Shah when the revolution happened. And now it has close to 20 million people living in it. So these cities became the melting pots of national identity. If there was any, idea in your head that you were an Iranian, that you were more aspiring to your regional identity, these metropolises in the past 47 years removed that. And they became like, I remember watching one of these Iranian social media influencers who had been invited to Israel, Yunus, and he was talking on an Israeli show they're interviewing, and the guy said, okay, so there's all these tribes, and so how can we divide it? And he was like talking like, of course, that's what everybody wants, right? And Yunus was shocked, and he said, if that's going to happen, it's better if there was no defeat of the Islamic Republic. Like this was his way of, expressing how much he thought that was not a good idea, and he went the other extreme, and a lot of people on Twitter, when all of these Twitter spaces were happening, where Jews and Persians were talking, when this idea would come up, the Iranians would say, "Wait, we were willing to die for the unity of the country," and these were people who were diehard, against the regime, and so this is a very, very dangerous strategy. In the Iranian world, it's understood that Israel can pursue the strategy of supporting separatists as long as it's at war with the Islamic Republic, and it's an existential war. Therefore, it has to do whatever it has to do to defend itself. And in a lot of Iranian conversations that I have attended and watched, that's what people say. They say that Israel has the right to do that, because it's an existential war against Islam. Therefore, if it has to use the separatists as a wedge to weaken them, that's great. But the moment the Iranians united behind the crown prince and finally said we're willing to move on, everything changed. Now the understanding is that Israel will also basically unite behind the singular nation. And now any conversation that Israel would support separatists beyond the Islamic Republic, like if the Islamic Republic falls, great. But once beyond that, if Israel wants to support anything, that is seen as a war against Iran. And that's a far, far, far greater war than anything that Israel has had to deal with under this regime, because this regime doesn't have support of the Iranians. Right now, they had to bring militias from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan. Why? Because even though the majority of the population is under the age of 40 and everyone who is a man has gone to 2 years of military training, they can't give guns to their own people because they're afraid the people will turn the guns against them. So they have to bring ideologically aligned soldiers who believe in the cult of the supreme leader and the Mahdi from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan. But if Israel were to align against the Iranian nation, not just against Islam, then all of those people would fall in line and support the government. All those people who are not going to be armed today would want to be armed. And Israel would face a far greater opponent than the Islamic Republic. And so this, I don't know where this idea comes from, but in the past year, it's been a lot of, it's been very clear that because Iranians have never seen themselves as a collection of tribes, and no one ever talks about Iranians in that way. Like, let's say when Iranians left in the past 40 years to leave and live abroad, and they went to England and France and America and Canada and Australia and even Japan, no one ever spoke to Iranians as though they have come from a tribe. No one said, oh, which tribe are you from? Or something like that. Everyone always spoke to Iranians as though they're Iranians until this thing started to come out of Israel. And so in the landscape of this global conversation, it suddenly stands out that this rhetoric mainly comes out of Israel. And that's okay as long as it's a tool of war against the Islamic Republic. But once it's past that, it's very, very alarming. And it makes it difficult for Iranian Zionists to stand up for Israel because it pits Iranian Zionists against Iranian nationalism, which, as I said, is like a religion to Iranians. So that tribal mentality that you were saying, you're suddenly going against that. And the tribe has settled on empire. And empire can only be achieved through unity. Iranians aspire for greatness. All of those young people in the Turkish regions, the Kurdish regions, and the Baluch, all of those young guys, they all want a piece of that global pie. And they can only receive that through Tehran. Because when America wants to talk business, oil, gas, economy, military, it doesn't call the leaders of Baluchistan. It calls Tehran. And when Russia wants to talk, when England wants to talk, when Paris wants to talk, they all pick up the phone and they call Tehran. When the leader of Turkey wants to talk, he calls Tehran. When the Emir of Qatar wants to call, or the King of Saudi Arabia, or the leader of China, they all call Tehran. So we don't understand who are all of these. It sounds like someone created an idea and like spread it out, and then it took off. So that's what I hear in a lot of Iranian spaces. That as long as it's as a means of weakening Israel's existential enemy, the Islamic Republic, that's acceptable as fair play. But once it goes beyond that, it becomes a project for Iran as a nation, then that is seen as an attack against the Iranians as a whole, and it has the exact opposite effect. Now, in the Orthodox circles, the prophecy of Ezekiel 38:39 is seen mainly as all those tribes are within Iran that attack Israel, and therefore it's fair play to divide them ahead of time to weaken them. But some of those tribes mentioned in Ezekiel's prophecy are actually Hamite tribes that come from North Africa. It's a two-winged battle. And in the Christian division, those tribes form countries like Turkey and some of the stands of Russia, like Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, like where basically the Parthians lived, the second imperial phase of Iran, the Parthians. So the Iranians are mainly seen as one piece of that puzzle in the Christian way of dividing that prophecy. And therefore, you can weaken Iran as a central unit, and it can still participate in that war as a weakened nation in an alliance with other nations. That's the Christian perspective, makes room for unity and weakening that united government. The Orthodox view sees it still in the antiquities view of tribes. And therefore, it sees Paras as only one tribe. And you often hear, oh, the Persians, the Medes. But Iranians don't see themselves that way, the way that Jews don't see themselves as like belonging to the tribe of Issachar or Naphtali. They just see themselves as Israelis. Iranians see themselves in that light. That's why like the president is Kurdish and Turkish, but he's Iranian. He sees himself that way. Everybody sees him that way. He's the president of Iran. He signs for Iran, the MOU. Ghalibaf is Kurdish and Persian. Larijani, who was a main obstacle to peace, and he was killed. He was second in command. Khamenei put Larijani in command before he died. So when negotiations, Trump said, let's talk, Larijani was the guy, and he was like such an ardent Islamist. And so Trump had to say to Israel, kill him. And he was a really good day. The 2 days people celebrated was the death of Khamenei and the death of Larijani. These were the 2 days that Iranians nationally and globally celebrated. But Larijani was born in Najaf. He was born in Iraq. But his father was from the north of Iran, but he was a cleric. He went to Iraq because he was a devout Shia, and that's their place in the south of Iraq. And that's where Larijani was born, his son. So he was Iraqi. He grew up there, and then after the revolution moved to Tehran. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Arakchi. Arak is the Iranian word for Iraq. Chi means child. He's a child of Iraq. That's his last name, Arakchi. So all of these people are from all kinds of regions. A lot of them are Arabs, Kurds. There's lots of Kurds in the Iranian IRGC. And in the heads of the IRGC, there's lots of Kurdish people. And yet everybody considers themselves to be Iranian. And that's the mentality of how people see themselves. So the Kurdish separatists, they said when there was this talk that they were going to attack, they made an announcement, and they said they want all the Kurds to leave the IRGC because they're about to attack and they want to kill their own people. But I never heard of a single Kurdish defection. I mean, everyone is following the news like under a microscope. That would have been all over the place. No one, they didn't, because they don't associate with those separatists. They associate with the IRGC. And so that's how Iran is divided. Iran is divided around political parties, Islamic or non-Islamic belief. It's divided around those who reject theocracy and those who want it. It's divided around those who want to gravitate towards Marxism, like many people in the opposition, and those who want to gravitate towards the West and Israel, like the followers of the Crown Prince, which form the majority of the opposition. That's how Iran must be studied. That's how you leverage it for yourself or weaken it by understanding the way it's a modern country that sees itself along those intellectual and political and religious lines, not around tribal lines. It sees the tribal divisions mainly for internal cultural purposes. Now, there are strong movements that have emerged among the Turks and Kurds, especially during the last 47 years. The Baluch were very much, persecuted by the Islamic Republic. So this has led to a backlash of movements within these groups that want to have their own thing, but it's more like a dream. It's more like an aspiration than anything that has the strength of reality, because on the other side of the fence, there is this much larger population from all the regions, including from those regions, that prefers the unity system. And even if there was a moment of weakness in central government, it would very quickly be cured. And the new central government, which would have all the big guns and all the money of the oil and everything, would rise up within like a week or two and crush all of these groups. And it would just be like a moment, like a 5-minute news story on the news, because everyone would be for it. So the only thing that it would create would be animosity towards any force that would have supported them. Any force that would have supported these, it would create animosity against them, while their project would never succeed. And that's why the Kurds have never separated in the last 47 years, or in the days of the king, or in the past 2,500 years. They are the Medes. I mean, that's who they are. They're moved out. Like the trunk of the tree was in Iran. They moved out into Iraq, and they moved into Turkey, and they were running the Persian Empire. I mean, they were one of the main tribes, and the Sassanians. And then the Arabs came and they cut it. And they cut it, and then the group of the Medes, or of the Kurdish sect of the Medes, they got stuck in Turkey and in Iraq. They got stuck on the Arab side of the Islamic Caliphate system, while the mother branch remained in Iran. And Kermanshah, there's tons of people in Kermanshah that are from the younger generation, and they don't want to separate. So the people want there to be a change of government, and they want there to be a referendum. And the reason the separatists, who call themselves federalists, they don't want to wait for the referendum is because they know they would lose it. No one would pick their federalism. I mean, some people would, but not enough. People feel that federalism would fracture the country. But regardless, whether people will pick federalism or not, everyone wants the ballot box to determine what will come next, rather than a group armed by the outside supporting might want to take a piece of the country to themselves right now. Because the central government, I can tell you 150% will rise, and within like weeks take that place back with ballistic missiles and everything. All these missiles are not going to be destroyed, right? They'll just like shoot them down with ballistic missiles, and will rush in with an army of hundreds of thousands and take them back. But they will remember who was behind it, who supported them. They will remember that, because those people will be seen as enemies of the nation, not as enemies of Islam. And so that's very dangerous. It's a very dangerous policy that Israel promotes, and we don't know where it comes from, but it comes from a profound misreading of the Iranian system. Yes, there was grievances and separatists in times of national division, but right now Iran has entered into a great time of national unity. So now, where is it going to go from here? So I was telling the story that, I went to Iran, told in the 1990s, 1999, to my dad that there'll be a war with Israel, but he shouldn't support it because God is with Israel. That we read the Bible, they came to faith. Now, that is part of a large movement that is happening in the country. Bibles are pouring into the country, like to the point where organizations that are bringing Bibles can't catch up, can't stick with the number of Bibles that are requested.
Supply and demand.
Supply and demand. So people are reading for the first time the story of Israel through the pages of the Bible at a time where they don't have any teachers teaching them how to read it. There is not enough teachers. So they're just reading it raw. And they're reading the Psalms and they're reading raw. And that's changing their view of Israel. And they're sharing that with their friends and family who may not come to faith in the Messiah, but who are still in their family, and they kind of influence them. Then there is the severing from Islam and the return to the pre-Islamic view of Iran. And people don't know much about the history of the Jews and the Persians, which is mainly recorded in the Hebrew Bible, but they know about Cyrus and how he said rebuild the temple. The crown prince has made that famous. That's become famous in the past few years. So the average person has that in the back of their mind, that was a good thing. And I took an Uber here a couple of years ago, and the driver was from the Basij, from the IRGC's civilian unit. And he had left Iran because he had fallen away from Islam. And he said, the guy, Muhammad, was a pedophile. I don't understand how we could ever not see that. Or when they told us that Khomeini's picture appeared in the moon, we all believed it, and now it seems so. And he said all of these Shia imams that are buried all over Iran, he's like, they never even made it to Iran. They all died in Arabia. So he said, I realized we were fooled. But he said, I still have a lot of family in the Basij. And he came from the poorer parts of town. And I said to him, well, what percentage do you think are in it for the money? What percentage for the ideology? He said it's 50-50. And I said to him, well, what if there's a war with Israel? What are you going to do? He said, I would fight for Israel against the regime. I said, why would you do that? He said, look, imagine you belong to a family and your father goes to war with somebody else. And everybody assumes you're going to fight with your father. That's the natural thing to do. But you hate your father so much that you will take a side with his enemies against him. And so that's the third reason why people are gravitating towards Israel. They just hate this regime so much that they assume that whatever the regime says is good must be bad, and whatever the regime says is bad, it must be good. They don't have a lot of depth of understanding, but they just have an emotional need to go against the regime. Mm-hmm. So the support from Israel comes from the nascent Christian movement. It comes from the divorce from Islam and a return to the antiquity of Persia and how it saw Judea. And it comes from just the hatred of the regime. It's kind of like you vote for somebody else, not because you want to vote for them, but because you hate the person who's running. And so they get this vote. So these are the three kind of, pro-Israel like veins, but they are pouring into what forms the majority of the population. And the ideologues are isolated to the point where they have to shut the internet down, kill their own people in the tens of thousands, arrest about 100,000 people, torture, rape them, and bring militias from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan because they don't have internal support. But what holds them into power is continuously, not only their guns, but people are ready to get armed and organized now that they see the light at the end of the tunnel. Before, there was no point. The psychological programming of the IRGC created fear, and they were being supplied by the money of oil and gas. And therefore, they could buy weapons and control everybody. So the IRGC has taken over the country to form a security state, and that's where we are now. We have gone from theocracy to security state. That's the new version. Mm-hmm. But it will be short-lived because people don't want it. But now that Israel has destroyed the leaders of the IRGC, it has removed the aura of invincibility. So one of the signs that people made during the protest was, we are no longer afraid. And this was thanks to Israel in the 12-day war. Then the death of Khamenei ended the project of political Islam, of this idea that you can take the 7th century laws and make it the basis of a modern and complex state. This is the only country in the world that runs by Sharia law. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, none of these countries run by Sharia law. They have Sharia law infusion in them, but they know it has limits because it can't function in a modern world. They have limits, but Iran doesn't have limits. It is entirely designed around Sharia law and the foreign policy around eschatology, the end of days. And this is not sustainable. And the death of Khamenei ended this project. So now what we're witnessing is the end of this experiment of Khomeini, the supreme leader who created the country system, and Ali Shariati, the University of Tehran professor who convinced technocrats to believe in the Sharia law, and who came in. The soldiers, the IRGC, soldiers were formed in the Warsaw Pact nations. Ali Shariati brought the technocrats, and Khomeini brought the disciples that formed the Hezbollah party and the clergy, and they formed a Sharia law-based state of political Islam. And the death of the new supreme leader, Khamenei, ended that project. The IRGC has moved in to form a security state. They want to do business with Putin. They want to become like the Wagner organization for Putin. They will receive money and they will carry out his bidding in return for rebuilding the Shia Crescent and maintaining their own power. And they will run a security state by being in everybody's phone, by being spies in everybody's telephone system. But Putin is weakening. The war in Ukraine has not gone well for him. He has lost Damascus, and the French and the English and the Americans are moving in. Now they have made a deal with the Muslim Brotherhood with al-Jawlani, and they have made a deal with Turkey. So they are supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. But Russia seems to be a little bit outside of that, even though behind the doors, both Qatar and even the UAE and Turkey, are friends, and Saudi Arabia do business with Russia. And so does the IRGC. So the IRGC's plan is not going to work as well as it thought it could. And they also don't have popular support at a time where revolution is rising and people see the light at the end of the tunnel. So right now people are finally organizing in revolutionary units. And now the question is, can Israel supply weapons to the followers of the Crown Prince and unite with the opposition rather than focus on small groups that fracture the country? But that's Israel's, intelligence services have to make that decision. Maybe it's too better for Israel to unite with the separatists and fracture the country from the point of view of weakening the regime. I don't know. I mean, that these are assessments that the intelligence services of Israel have to make. But from a cultural perspective, it seems like not a good idea because it alienates Israel from the national love that right now has developed towards it. Everybody loves Bibi. Everybody knows that in the past 47 years, only one country rose against the regime. In the time of the Shah, the generals and the officers of the army had a standing order when it came to the Islamic Mujahideen, those devoted to jihad. The standing order was kill or be killed. Kill or be killed. And so everybody knows that the only way to get rid of these guys is to kill them, and only Israel has been willing to do that. And so the people are very grateful to Israel, but that national love has to be maintained with the support of those who want to topple the regime and keep the country united, I think, personally. But again, that's the personal decision that Israel has to make based on a huge amount of consideration and data that it collects that I don't have access to. I only have my little tiny anecdotal perspective of things. So I don't have access to data or intelligence or anything like that to know what's really going on in those groups, or how they can be leveraged. But I do know that Iranians have an allergic reaction that's instinctive to anybody that wants to divide them, and that they don't see themselves that way. And I know that the cities have become a great place of unity. So there's an opportunity moving forward from here once the 60 days are over and we finally get past the midterms and Trump doesn't have to worry as much about politics, even though he may still have to worry about, the price of oil and inflation. However, because he can't bring the interest rates down without that. However, I don't think he's going to run again. I think this is it for Trump. And I think that legacy will become more important for him than continuation of power once he's past the midterms. Whether what he and Jared Kushner and Witkoff and Vance, JP Vance, are saying to us all that they essentially have two deals. One is the one we're all seeing, but the other is an unspoken deal, which the country is ready for normalization and allowing American businesses in to balance China's influence in Iran, but yet America wants to play nice with China and wants the oil to flow to China's economy. So they can have their cake and eat it too, because there's people in the regime that have decided they want to move past theocracy, which is the IRGC. I mean, they want a security state. And that somehow they're not being fooled. They're actually making a deal with genuine people who've genuinely decided that they want to turn the page. Now, this doesn't make sense once you understand the Constitution and the system. You can't just do whatever you want. It's a real country with courts and laws and parliament and a constitution, and it's a real thing. It's a real country. You can't just decide that you're going to just do it in a different way. So we don't understand what they're saying, because what they're saying, that Trump and these guys are saying to us, doesn't jive with the way the Islamic Republic is set up. So if after 60 days they can't agree on the nuclear, they won't give up the enriched uranium, but then Trump is saying they don't need it anymore because he's watching it from his eye from the sky. They won't give up the ballistic missile system, which is part of their Islamic ideology of expansionism. They won't reduce it to 300 kilometers range for self-defense. But Trump is saying, well, the Arabs have ballistic missiles. Why can't they have it? So we don't know. We don't know if he's just saying that now because he wants to keep them calm and change his focus to the stock market and the midterm, or whether he actually is saying it like for real. Then the militias that they support in the south of Iraq, they want to rebuild Hezbollah in Lebanon as the oil money comes in, and they are negotiating a new agreement with Syria. So this whole construct is not even part of the conversation. The militia system is not part of the conversation. The ballistic missiles have been jettisoned. The removing of uranium is no longer a priority. So if all they have to do is put the nuclear uranium enrichment on hold for 15 years, Trump seems to signal that he's willing to go with that, and then they can wait for Trump to not be president in 2029, and life goes on for them. This sounds insane, and so now is the time to pour as much support in supporting anyone. If the people inside are not organizing, then too bad. They'll have to live with the consequences of the rule of the IRGC. But if they are organizing, this is what the Crown Prince is saying, that there's tremendous organization happening right now. If that's really finally taking place, then those people need to be armed, because there will be an armed conflict with the proponents of jihad. They are going to let go if something rises. But if you're putting money in their pockets by allowing them to sell oil, and you're allowing them to use that money to buy back weapons and mercenaries, and you are essentially making them a more valuable piece of the global puzzle. Right now, it looks like they lost the Shia Crescent. They can't control the economy. The currency is collapsing. The people are rising against them. They're not good for business. They're not good for Russia. They're not good for China. They're not good for regional order. So the Security Council in March of 2025 had a closed-door meeting about Iran, and Khamenei said that they're conspiring against him and had his government file an official complaint. But that's what they did. They decided that this regime had to go. And so they started to really constrict it gradually, because it's crazy and it's jihadi, and it can kind of go, wow. So they but now Trump is rebuilding them, and that's very bad. It makes revolution inside more difficult because it beefs up the apparatus of oppression. It gives them a more important place in the global order. Makes the Chinese are like, oh, we can do business with these guys still. The Americans are supporting them, and it makes Israel look more like a troublemaker if it continues to support, Iranian revolutionaries. So what has to happen is that the Persian, in my opinion, the Iranians, they don't care at all about America or what America thinks. Iranians are a very well developed. As I said, the Iranians have been fighting the Greeks, the Romans, the Europeans, the Russians. The Iranians have a very well developed national identity. They see themselves a little bit bigger than they really are. Like, they have a big ego, and they see themselves at the level of like world power, even though they're not. They're a collapsing economy, and a failed state. But they have this feeling in their hearts and minds. They don't care about the Americans. If the Jews are like, yeah, we'll help you go have a revolution, they're like, yeah, let's do it. They don't care if the president of the United States says that's a good idea or a bad idea. They couldn't care less. So the question is Israel willing to, come on board? Of course, they want, Iranians would like the support of Trump, and they want to, stay on the good side of his thinking to get that support, as Israel does, of course, but from the point of view of politics and human psychology. But ultimately, if he's not going to come on board, and if he says, forget it, I don't want to support revolution, nobody in Iran cares what Trump thinks at that point. And so the question is, can there be a Judeo-Persian alliance that is deepened now that there has been a breakthrough because of Israel's tremendous and miraculous victories, that Israel's operations that have not all been fully activated that exist in Iran can the opposition in Iran outside of the separatist groups form organization and want to get armed? Can Israel get arms in the way that it got the satellite dishes in, the Starlink dishes in? Can it now get weapons in? And can the revolution continue, or at least can it be used as another tool? Israel can continue to support separatists, can continue to support nationalists, anything that weakens the regime internally while waiting to see how they fare on the global stage. If Israel is willing to go forward with that, and that's what Naftali Bennett is signaling in his speeches, even though he's not even, I don't think he even has a seat in the Knesset, but he's one possible candidate to take over the prime ministership, as Bibi's, eventually will have a sunset to his life and to his career, as everyone does. And he's had a glorious, career, and he's been the man of the hour. And he was really the guy that was needed for this war because of his international connections and his understanding of American politics. But he's also been the guy who's been laser focused on the threat of the Islamic Republic. And he's very much loved by tens of millions of Iranians because he was the one man who decided that he was going to actually attack and kill them. And so this is something that if Naftali Bennett, continues this and begins to work with the Iranian opposition, that can go places between now and 2028, because the problems of Iran are systemic. They're not something that can be solved by a few $100 million or billions of dollars poured into the coffers. The system inside is not designed to run a country. It's designed for Islamic expansion. And therefore, it can be fixed by a law or a decree of parliament or something like that. It has to be a reboot of the system. And the ideological divide between the people and the government is at an all-time high. So even if a portion of the population gets seduced back into the system because of some economic relief, like right now the currency has had a bounce back, all those systemic problems will come back to the surface, like a relationship that has issues that are not resolved, even though something might happen for a while that makes those issues go away, but those issues are just, camouflaged. So we're going to see the younger generation continue wanting to pull away out of theocracy back into a national government. And we're going to see the economic problems, the lack of future, the lack of integration into the world. And so the idea that Trump and Vance and Witkoff and Kushner are selling to all of us, that economic integration is the beginning of political change, if that's true, let's just say for a second that it's true, that Ghalibaf, who is a bridge like right now, and he's a huge IRGC guy, he has enough clerics and leaders of the IRGC behind him who've said to him, we are ready to go beyond not only the theocracy, but beyond the rule of the IRGC. We are ready. Then that would mean that he is essentially surrendering to America. Why? Because they are a revolutionary Islamic ideological government. When they compromise on the ideals of the revolution and normalize with their religious enemies, that is the same as surrendering what they stand for and the power structure that supports it. Their base would crumble and the people would finish them off. So that means that this is the beginning of surrender terms, and that Ghalibaf will be remembered as the man who ended the regime like Gorbachev ended the Soviet Union. That is a possibility. It's a possibility. But right now, they're outside of what Trump and Vance are telegraphing to us, and Witkoff and Kushner, that they're saying, really, that's what's going on. There is no evidence for that anywhere within the system that we can see as normal, regular people who don't have access to what's behind closed doors. There is no evidence of that. Right now, everything that's known about the system says that they are fooling America at a time where Trump needs the midterms to rebuild. It's a hudna. That's all it is to them. It's a hudna. Like the leaders of the IRGC are saying, we don't consider this a ceasefire. We consider this a quieting of the guns. That's what they go on television. They say, we don't consider this to be a ceasefire. We consider this to be a quieting of the guns, or meaning that their power projection is at maximal, optimal. They're ready for martyrdom, ready for conquest. They're not giving up. So we're gonna have to see.
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful that the system won't survive, that the death of Khamenei was the end of an era, that Israel will become more involved, that they won't agree with Trump in 60 days, and Trump will have to change his tune once the midterms are over, and that revolutionary protests will begin again in the country once people take a break and digest this war that just happened. People need to just digest. People have gone to their country homes. Their businesses have been turned off. Tons of e-businesses have gone under because the internet was off for 80 days. So people who ran things like, Airbnb or Uber or, the Iranian version of all of these things, e-commerce, Amazon, all of the people who had those businesses of, in a population of 90 million people, it's its own market. All of that has gone, a lot of people have got bankrupt because of the internet closures. Other people have, lost their jobs. So right now the country is just recalibrating from the war and waiting to see where these negotiations land and what happens, what opens, what doesn't, where the government stands. But those grievances will bring people back in the street. So we're going to see the revolution continue, and hopefully Trump will finally shift his stance from submission and negotiation to wanting to make a deal with someone on the other side of this regime. And he will finally support the people. And Israel, which is already in there supporting the people, will be able to do that more openly, unless this Ghalibaf is acting like Gorbachev and is surrendering the country, the regime, to Trump and signing essentially the beginnings of normalization, which is basically surrender for an Islamic state. In that case, the plan that these guys have would be to turn around to the people and say, don't kill us. We got you through this without bloodshed. We internally fixed it. We took down the radicals ourselves, even though they're radicals themselves, but we took on the ones that don't want to do business with America, and we are ready for change. Let's have new elections. Let's rethink the Constitution. And in this way, they want to buy for themselves a place in the next government and not surrender the country to the crown prince. So we'll see if this is really what Trump and Vance and Witkoff and Kushner have been promised, and this is all real or not. We're going to find out in 60 days. But for now, all we know is money is pouring into jihad, into global jihad, and it's not good for the world. And people in Iran are just recalibrating themselves and finding their bearings. So we'll have to see where it goes. Yeah. So I want to just end with one story from Iran. That trip, so I didn't finish my story. After my dad and his wife got baptized, and they said, let's go to Shiraz. And I said, he said, let's leave after midnight. It's a 11-hour drive because people don't respect the rules of the road. And everyone drives very fast. And it's don't. So we left late at night. And by the time you get to Qom, which is 90 minutes south of Tehran, where the seminary is, then it's all desert from there. That's where the highway really begins. And it's a 10-hour desert to Shiraz. And we were going to sleep in Esfahan, which is the city in between the two, because we'd get there in the early hours in the morning, 3 or 4 in the morning. And then the next morning we would drive the second leg to Shiraz. So my dad's wife is driving. He's sitting in the back seat with his hands on both of the front seat. And I'm have my back to the passenger door. And I'm facing both of them, and I'm talking about the Bible because that's what they want to hear. And it's they're drinking it up. And I only have 2 weeks just for Christmas holidays, and they just want to drink as much as they can get. And suddenly my dad's wife points to the window behind my head, and she makes these weird noises like and there I don't pay attention to what she's seeing because I'm so caught up in what I'm saying. But my dad looks at her and says, Nima, what's wrong? And he now looks, and they're both now making the same noise and pointing out the window. And I'm like, what's wrong with you guys? So I sit properly in my seat and I look out the window, and, not too far out, up in the sky, there's a giant spherical green object, and it's slowly coming down, and it's huge. Like it would be, 2-3 stories tall if it was a building on the ground, maybe even longer, bigger. And it has green lights all around it, and I can see divisions, and it's glowing, pulsating green, like with a green pulp, like that. And slowly coming down, and then when it's perpendicular to the car, I thought I saw a giant black cylinder come out of the ground. And this thing came, and the moment it was exactly on top of the cylinder, it went into the ground in the blink of an eye. And she then said, this is a sign from God to show us that all that Ali is saying is true, meaning about the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And I just kind of quietly sank in my seat. I was like, I couldn't, I was like, what? I had a UFO sighting. And so basically, that event, it took my attention to the study of another part of the Bible, which had to do with the world of angels, the Rechev Elohim and the Rechevesh. So David talks about the Rechev Elohim, and Isaiah talks about the Rechevesh, the chariots of fire and the chariots of God. And even Isaiah, Yeshayahu, he talks about the God will come in his chariots, Merkavot, and bring judgment, with fire. And so then I remembered, even right there in the car, I thought about Sarparas, the prince of Persia, who is this principality, this angel behind, the Persian Empire that goes from the Hindu Kush to the Mediterranean, which includes Turkey and Egypt and all the Arab countries. They're all under Sarparas, including Iran, this whole being. And I thought, how long have they been here? Because in the scroll of Daniel, an angel comes to bring a message to Daniel, but the prince of Persia withstands him for 21 days, it says. The angel, the Sarparas, fights the angel for 21 days. And I thought, how long have they been here with their, rikvot? And the Rechev Elohim, is a word that applies not only to the God of Israel, but to the gods of the nations. It applies to all of these beings, So that really brought me to study the story of powers and principalities and the war of angels, and how that tied into the age that we live in today in the story of the Bible. But there's a lot going on in that country, sociologically, religiously, politically, intellectually. There's UFO sightings. There's everything happening in Iran. And so but it's all under this iron curtain through which the whole world sees that jurisdiction. When people think about Iran, they mainly think about the regime, because that's all that's visible. Everybody else is living under the iron curtain. Will Trump be remembered as the Ronald Reagan who took down the iron curtain? Or will he be another appeaser president like Carter, like Obama? Well, we have about a year and a half left to witness that together. I know where Israel stands. Everybody knows where Israel stands, which is Israel wants the regime to go and the cycle of violence to stop. And we know where the majority of the Iranian people, both inside and outside, stand, which is they want the same. The question is, where does the President of the United States stand and his advisors? So that's what we're going to find out in the year and a half. But I suspect that because of all the evil these guys have done, and they've done tremendous evil, they've been a very, very dark and evil regime. And that, October 7th type things happen in Iran every week. Killings. I remember when they shut the internet down, and once in a while, either through satellite, but people were brave enough to call into this Iranian radio show in London. And this guy called in the early days when they shut the internet down and they started the killings. He said, "You have no idea what's going on. They're coming into the streets and they're shooting teenagers at the end of the driveway to send a message to the parents." And this Iran International was able to put some footage together from the morgues and hospitals that had rooms and rooms of body bags inside of them. And they were able to get some sound bites from people inside and made a little documentary, actually. And one person inside said, "A great sense of sorrow has come over the whole country, and everyone is just in a state of shock." Then 40 days later, when the 40th anniversary or the 40th memorial of the dead came, and everyone goes to the tomb, and it was mainly parents going to the tomb of their children, since the majority of the people that were killed were in their 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And they put the internet back on, actually. This was a moment where the internet was back on. And so all these footage came out of parents making speeches in the tomb of their children. And every single speech was about how usually you scare us, but this time you've sealed your faith that our children haven't died in vain. That the very technique that they've always used to push everyone down into fear, this time they went too far. And this has actually created the very seeds of their fall. The resolve that they've put in the hearts and minds of the parents whose children they killed. So I think that I saw a lot of footage. A lot of footage came out from the government officials themselves once they shut the internet down, and they were the only ones speaking. They have a special SIM card that allows them that. It's called the white SIM card, and it allows them that to do that. The head of the main, there's several telecommunication companies, but the head of the main one, he did refuse at some point to shut the internet down, and they had to remove him. But basically, they were going on their social media, and they were filled with panic. Tons of them, panic. They could feel how much they had no idea how much rage there exists in the country against them. And they were saying things like, "Can we not talk about this?" Like they were like sitting in their cars like we do and filming themselves and saying things like, "Can we not have a conversation about this? Can we not have a cultural conversation about this and come to a compromise?" Others were saying like, "You guys have left Islam? When did that happen? If that's the case, then that changes everything." And it wasn't just a cleric whose story I told. Other people, just regular people, were saying this. So there's a lot that suddenly came to surface, both from the people and their videos saying that, we're never going to let go. You've crossed the line. And then the government people. So there's so much happening in Persian language at such high speed and mass volume right now in the internet among the people that no one has time to translate it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so much that the world outside of the Iranian community has no idea. I remember when the Crown Prince, said to the people outside of Iran, "Come on July 14th to 3 cities, Toronto, LA, and Munich." And globally, people came out, close to 1 million people came out. And it shifted the policies of Trump. one of my cousins who had recently moved here, he came to Toronto, and we went to the protest together. And he said to me, did you tell any of your West Canadian friends to come? And I was about to turn around to him to explain to him that everything's just happening so fast. He just interrupted me. He said, yeah, everything's happening so fast. By the time he explained to them, the revolution will be over. I'm like, exactly. This is a way of saying, like, the amount of conversation that's happening right now among Iranians, both online and in reality, is happening at such huge speed and magnitude, like volume, that it's not possible to, there'll be books and documentaries later, but at this point, it's not possible to convey it to everybody else. And so sometimes the things that people are saying, both on the American and Israeli side, it is the voice of those who are distant from the speed of this conversation. And the obsession is constantly about the regime. But the regime is just one piece of the conversation. The Iranians themselves are asking themselves questions that they haven't asked in 47 years. So we'll have to see if these guys can normalize and stabilize and capture a portion of the population back and prolong the security state past Trump. Because if they do, then they'll be here for a while. Or are people going to not want it rise? They're not going to be able to play nice with Trump and agree because they fundamentally can't, and they have no intention of normalizing. And they're hoping right now that Trump loses the Congress. That's usually, unless there's a plan within a plan that we don't know about, that's their normal way of thinking. They want Trump to lose Congress and to be in a gridlock, because the Democrats 7 times tried to stop the war. 7 times. They brought legislation to stop the war, and Trump, they couldn't get enough numbers. But if they take Congress, they'll have the numbers to stop the war. And they support the progressives. They support the Islamic Marxist alliance against Israel and against the Judeo-Christian pillars of the West. That's who the progressives support in the Democratic Party. So they see these guys as an ally in the great war against Zion, against the Temple Mount, against Mount Zion. And they will support them. And if they do, the Iranian people will have to make a choice whether they want to go into revolution now that Trump is no longer as powerful as he was, whether Israel is in there really significantly providing weapons, whether people are organizing. These are all things we're going to discover together. And the survival of the regime and the change in the system. My personal intuition is that the system has gone into irreversible change. That the death of Khamenei has changed things beyond what we are seeing right now on the surface, and that the security state of the IRGC will be much more short-lived than their ambitions, unless the United States essentially does business with them and normalizes them and gives them enough money to survive. We'll have to see.
You're right. Yeah. I hope you're right on that. I would love to see them never raise their heads again.
Exactly.
And that the world can be a better place.
Completely.
And one of the points that you made, which is the Iranian-Israeli alliance.
Yes.
What a power play that would be on the world scene. You know, what a positive collaboration. What a change for the future, for the good. You know,
they would create a Sabbath of history in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And the Iranians inside of the country, I mean, outside everyone supports Israel. Inside, there's tens of millions of people that support Israel, more than any other country in the entire Middle East. And I think there would be a huge desire to work with Israel. If Israel is ready to reach into Iran, assuming if Iranians, like the Crown Prince is saying, are actually organizing finally in revolutionary units. Because if they're not, then Israel has nothing to reach into other than the militias that are the separatists. But if the Iranians themselves organize in units of revolution, then Israel can actually have something to work with. But that unity, the Judeo-Persian unity, would weaken the Muslim Brotherhood tremendously.
I would love to see that. I would love to see that.
Yeah, me too. The Crown Prince, his followers, which is right now he's the main opposition figure, but not the only one. He represents the portion of Iranians that are pro-West, pro-liberalism, pro-capitalism, and pro-Israel. But the other opposition figures, they want a French-style republic rather than a British-style constitutional monarchy. And they lean away from Islam, but they lean towards variations and shades of Marxism.
That's not good.
That's not good. And believe it or not, they are the ones that are pushing for federalism. And that's where the separatists find their home inside of the Iranian political construct. The separatists only make a lot of noise for outsiders, but inside of Iran's political discourse, they always tone it down and they become federalists. And they find their identity politics better receptive in the left. And a lot of the Kurdish leaders from the 60s and 70s were outright Marxists. They were Marxist groups. And they even created a Marxist federation inside of Kurdistan, the province of Kurdistan, for a little while before it got crushed, because that's who they align with. Now they've let go of Marxism because even though they're still the same old guys that run it, they let go of Marxism because that's not popular anymore. But all the opposition outside of the Crown Prince leans to the left of the political spectrum and sees Israel through that lens. It doesn't see Israel. So the leaders of the oppositions that the separatists are cozy with and that are outside the Crown Prince. So when Bibi doesn't say he supports the Crown Prince, maybe he's doing it because he doesn't want the Crown Prince to appear as a puppet of Israel. Or maybe Trump does it for the same reason. But the truth is that the people that support him are the people that support Israel. And that's why he came to Israel and went to the Kotel and wore a kippah, which is basically a suicide in the Muslim world. For a leader to go to a Kotel and put on a kippah, you might as well put a bullet in your political career. But he didn't lose at all, following at all. All of the things he says about Israel, that his first political act will be to normalize and recognize the state of Israel, that does not take at all any support from him. And I've been watching that closely to see if that would be the case. And it wasn't. Just as many people, his Instagram page, when the internet was shut down, it went from 35 to 37 million likes to 5 to 7 million likes. Everybody realized that it was the people inside that were liking him. His supporters are mainly the millennials and the Generation Z because they have never known the rule of the Shah, and they hearken back to a golden age where Iran was respected and they were respected. And that was the time where they see the footage. The Shah comes to New York and Kennedy welcomes him and Nixon welcomes him. And they thirst for that golden age where they were respected on the world stage rather than being seen as this extensions of this terrorist Hamas-like regime that represents the poor, the uneducated, and a tiny portion of the Iranian people, which relate more to a civilizational construct. And so they are thirsty to have this paradigm shift, this brand shift. And so they are the ones liking his speeches and they see him as their guy. And that's why when they shut the internet down, his likes fell. And that's when everyone, including everybody here and everybody, because you have to understand when the people came and called for the crown prince in January, that wasn't just a surprise for the regime. That was a surprise for everybody living here. He never had that kind of support. So once they shut the internet down and the likes fell on Instagram, they had to start an official investigation as to what had happened. They had missed this. And they said that Israel, over the course of decades, had been running subtly in a background an influence operation to promote the Instagram videos of the Crown Prince as one more divisive act against them. Not that they supported him over the separatists or anybody else. They were just going at it. Here was one more. They had their intelligence and information gathering had shown, hey, this guy has support in this country and we can build into it. And they had tweaked the algorithms the way that the Russians had done it with the American election. This is what they said. This could be another slander against Israel, as they always like to demonize Israel and make it like the boogeyman that's behind everything, as you know. Or maybe there was truth. I have no idea. But the point is that his support came from inside. So I don't know how much support he has within the system, whether there can be defections. He says there is. I don't know. So I don't even know how viable it is beyond popular support, whether it has teeth. But definitely we're at a crossroads. And if the Persians and the Jews can unite against the Islamic Republic and take it down, that will complete the circle of blessings that once upon a time, the Jews were the weak and scattered among the nations in Babylon, and the Persians were the ones with political and military power, and they freed the Jewish people from the house of bondage. And this time, it's the Jews that are returning the favor, repaying that biblical debt and completing the circle and setting things right. So that there would be something quite biblical about it in the architecture of God's, plan of blessing and being blessed with the covenanted people. And then the Iranians would be, they would get a second chance. Now, what they do with that is theirs. The forces of Marxism could come through the university system, and Zionism would grow, but maybe people, I don't know how good Israel would be to promote Zionism inside of Iran, or how much the Christian movement would expand. So it's possible that down the road, a Marxist parliament could align with the remnants of the Muslim Brotherhood. But at least for now, there would be a massive, and there would be a huge portion of the population, like the Prime Minister of Canada declared a Palestinian state, while the hostages languished in the tunnels of lawlessness and violence. Yet many Canadians stood against it, but that it's a parliamentary system. Iran could go in that direction. But at least the rise of Iran with the support of Israel and the destruction of the Islamic Republic would be poetic justice against an evil regime that vowed the destruction of Israel. And it would be the repaying of a biblical and ancient debt that would set the Middle East on a new course, at least for a period, where it would enter an age of light and peace and a Sabbath that I think everyone in the Middle East is craving. Among the Arabs, the Persians, and the Jews, everybody needs a break and needs to focus on building their own family and country instead of fighting. So this would be a game changer. So I think it really, as long as Trump is president, I think hopefully these guys don't have a plan other than the old plan of their Islamic war against the West, and that they're not going to be able to play nice, and that this is just a ruse they have to reset themselves for war. And that Israel and that Iranians were finally going to wake up and start organizing now that they see the possibility of change, like the Crown Prince is saying, but I don't know. and Israel and the Mossad and the IDF and the IAF and all of these forces will be able to reach into and help and really, really bring the revolution so that come the 50th year, which would be 2029, and 50 is the number of Jubilee in the Torah of, the books of Moses, where inheritance that is lost through debt is returned, and all of the economy of Israel is reset to its default mode, where you retreat, all your inheritance is returned to you. So hopefully the country will be returned to the people as the 50th year pulled. Not that the Iranian people are in a covenant with the God of Israel through the Torah, but that the spirit of this law would apply to the turning of history. So let's watch and see if the next year and a half are going to be the years of destiny in the Middle East, as the Persians and the Jews get to know each other better and form an alliance that will write history in the modern age as they have done so in antiquity.
Amen, and may it be so.
Yes.
Ali, this has been such a wonderful deep dive. Thank you for giving us the intricacies about Iran. I think I definitely learned a lot myself, and I imagine all the listeners that listening hopefully have been able to increase their knowledge and widen their scope and really understand this this region that is very complex, especially for Westerners. And I just really appreciate your time and just sharing your heart as well, and some very incredible stories.
You said to me in the beginning, "What's on your heart?"
Mm-hmm.
And usually when I go on an interview on a show, and I'm on shows and interviews all the time, I ask people how much time do we have, and they say 45 minutes, an hour, or you said 2, and I thought, oh, that's a long time. In my head, I thought, okay, 90 minutes, because and so I time my answers based on how much time I'm given. But I think I said everything that was on my heart. It seems that's what ended up happening. You gave me this room to speak, and I think I just poured out all my thoughts and everything that's on my heart. And I think what has been on my heart is to present more what's really going on, and who are the people, and what's the backstory beyond the skeletal structure of the regime, which is what most people outside see. And when they think of Iran, that's what they think of. But beyond that, there is a complex society with a continuous history and its own struggle with Islam and religion and this and that is living out this Islamic Republic phase of its history. It's living it out. So October 7th was new, and maybe it wasn't new, but it was horrific. But that kind of a rape and torture and arresting people happens every week in Iran, and has happened since the revolution, especially in the first 5 years of it. It was very, very intense. And it was the reign of, I didn't understand this concept of the reign of terror. But because those first 5 years of the revolution, I understand what that word means, the reign of terror. You really are literally afraid when you're walking down the street. Everyone is living really falling in line, because the smallest deviation, and there's cars driving all over the streets, every street, and the patrols, and they would just take you just like that, and you don't know what happened to you. Even right now in the arrest, there was lots of rape, and so this Jewish woman said to me after October 7th, she said, now I know what the Iranians have been escaping from, and why so many millions have left, because Iran didn't have any economic problems or any reason to leave, right? People left because they didn't want to live under the regime. That's the only reason you leave Iran. And so, and that was very touching, because that's true. So Iranians have been living their own struggle with this regime But the fact that it's finally reached Israel and triggered the IDF has been a great blessing, to the Iranian people. When the war started after October 7th, and I got involved in Jewish advocacy and advocating for Zion, I met this man, Amir, who is the founder of Tafsik, this organization that I work with. And we met at a rally, an Iranian rally, early on after October 7th for the Crown Prince. And now there was openness for Jewish people to come to the rally. And so he showed up to the rally with a giant Israeli flag, like on a pole, basically. And we met at that rally. We had decided to meet at the rally. And after the rally was over, there was a table of men who was selling some stuff. And I said to Amir, I said, listen, the Iranian people, they are really, really looking for the IDF to support them. And the hope is that the war is now going to reach Iran and the IDF is finally going to come, into Iran. And he said to me, no, we have no interest in that. Like as Jewish people, we have no interest in that. And I said, okay, I think that's where it's going. Then he turned around to this guy who had a table and was selling stuff. And we were about to go into Starbucks. And he said to the guy, do you want anything? And the guy said, it'd be great if you could get me a coffee. So we went to Starbucks. We had this conversation. We took the coffee. We came out. And he went over and he gave it to the guy. And he was passing the coffee to him. The guy looked at him and said, in his heavy Persian accent, we love the IDF. And I said to him, there you go. You see, this is how Iranians see it, because the Middle East is divided between those who want political Islam and those who don't.
Yeah.
And those who don't, they don't have an army. They don't have guns. There's only one army, and that's the IDF. The IDF is the army of all the people in the Middle East that reject political Islam and want democracy. The IDF is their only army, and that's why people listen to Radio Israel and look to Israel for inspiration. So if the IDF doesn't see itself that way, and it sees itself more as a tribal protection system, then it can fulfill its destiny and be unleashed, as the covenanted people to bring about justice and light into the Middle East. But again, I'm not the one fighting in the IDF, so it's easy for me to, to sit behind a microphone and say things like, go for it, go get them. It's easy for me to say that and then, go upstairs and make myself another cup of coffee. But so it really has to be a decision that's made by, the people who are at the heart of it.
Yeah.
But I think God will continue to give miraculous victories to Israel and protect Israel. And the evil that's around it will, rise and fall. Like it'll fall, rise again, and it'll fall, and eventually will collapse. And hopefully this is the time for this regime to completely disappear and a new system to rise in Iran. We all hope that that's where this war is going. And most Iranians that I talk to that are connected to the opposition system inside of Iran, that's what they tell me. They tell me that inside of the opposition system in Iran, it's basically a complete agreement that this is the time, that this system is going to fall. And that the only thing now that we're facing is that Trump needs to get past the midterms. Mm-hmm. And therefore he has to play nice to, as the Persians say, he's got to get his donkey to the other side of the bridge. Because when you're in the mountains and you get to these thin little bridges, sometimes even your donkey is like, are you crazy? I'm not crossing this bridge. So then you become all nice to your donkey. You're like, oh, you're just the greatest donkey there ever was. And you kiss it and you love it just to get it on the other side of the bridge. And once you do, you become, again, the harsh whipping master. And so that's become an expression when you're in these moments in time where you have to make a compromise. People say, he just needs to get his donkey to the other side of the bridge, and then it'll be business as usual. So we'll have to see. Thanks for having me, Doron.
Yes.
I look forward to our future conversations when the time comes and the system changes. We'll continue this conversation, but let's, l'chaim, and to the fall of this dark regime, and to peace and prosperity and shalom for the people of the Middle East, as light rises and darkness falls.
Amen, amen. Well, thank you, brother. This was great. And for those of you who have listened, make sure to look in the description below. I'll have all the links. You can follow Ali's amazing work and show him your support. Thank you, guys, and shalom from Israel.
Thank you. Shalom.